Have you ever been just a silly little guy living night to night in this Chungus blood mafia life? When you exist as a vampire in one of the world's major cities, most of the time your night to night thoughts are occupied with simple things. You deal with problems like, how am I gonna make sure the latest addition to my Hertz family won't come looking for him? Why did the sheriff tell me to keep an eye on a perfectly ordinary mortal residence in my domain? What will it take to garner the Primogen's favor so she'll allow me to purchase stakes in her financial trust? When will my granddaughter return from university so I can creepily spy on her while she's out on the town to remind me of what it was like to be human? Once you're established in your city, you'll probably know the prince, perhaps even see them somewhat regularly at Elysium if you're lucky. You might have carved out a nice little niche for yourself, and the power structure you were informed decades ago is called the Camarilla. You've probably also heard about the Anarchs and that they do things the wrong way, and maybe even the Sabbat, who do things an even wronger and more eviler way. You definitely know that there are other cities out there, other princes. It's possible you've even heard some of their names and know they are also part of this Camarilla. The ivory tower of which you have been told you are a privileged member. But you're just in there. You're not up there. And what goes on up there at the top? Why does the prince need to keep the Primogen happy? Whom does the prince take orders from? Is there like a vampire king or queen out there? Well, fret not, because I've studied the knowledge of vampire geopolitics and I can spill the beans. Some of them at least. And honestly, I can't really guarantee that they're all, strictly speaking, beans. Some of them might be rotten, or poisoned, or raisins, or marbles, human eyeballs even, that's a possibility. As with everything in the world of darkness, a lot of what I tell you today is steeped in bullshit. Not just because of contradictions and version differences, but also because misinformation is the point. Sires lie to their childer, nutjobs weave conspiracy theories, harpies and pack priests propagandize, which is to say that it's open to interpretation, and you should take away from it only what you think is fun. Throughout the history of Vampire the Masquerade, the overwhelming majority of play has taken place on the up-close and personal, the street level, your hometown. That is, as I like to say, where the meat and potatoes of the game is. The conflict between your soul and the beast, the downward spiral of losing your humanity, the personal horror of just how much it sucks to be a vampire. That's what the game is all about. But it is also about politics. Yeah, the inscrutable power play of invisible elders beyond the top of your local food chain tends to work best as a vague set of dark clouds in the sky that every once in a while rain blood on the city and never explain why. That's really all players ever experience of the ancient War of the Elders, known as the Jihad. But not all chronicles are like this. Especially after the year 2000, there was a strong focus on these types of high-level political games. So there's a lot of lore on it out there. And let me tell you, it's absolutely crazy. It's complex, convoluted, paradoxical, nonsensical, full of grand schemes, and local exceptions. Just conspiracies layered within conspiracies. In true World of Darkness fashion, it's just as bizarre and complicated as the geopolitical realities of our world, except involving monsters. Different types of monsters, certainly. So when you ask, is there a king of vampires, I can say no. However, there have been people who have called themselves kings or kings of certain regions, and some of them have a better claim to that than others. There's a clan of kings, and it makes up a plurality of the princes, and some of those princes factually can and do tell other princes what to do. Some might say Cain is the king of vampires, but then others might say, that's blasphemy. He's the god of vampires. And then others might say, that's blasphemy. Lilith is the goddess of vampires. And then even others would say, hang on, Cain isn't real. And claiming that he is blasphemy. As far as the Camarilla is concerned, and they are really the only thing that even comes close to a unified vampire world government, the answer is no. It does not formally recognize any authority higher than that of the prince. though that is a declaration made under an asterisk-spangled night sky. They are the organization we're going to focus on today, though we will talk about the various others extensively as well. And if you want to understand what the Camarilla is about, just think of them like this. It's the British aristocracy, but their mafia families, in the Holy Roman Empire as an EU-like federation of sovereign nations, where the institutions of church and state have become blended beyond distinction, right, putting sermons in the council chamber and tax collectors in the confession booth, but it's all secular and agnostic. Does that make sense? Yeah, well, it's not really supposed to. Like any large enough organization, the Camarilla is built on contradictions. They are, in fact, what makes it so resilient. It considers itself the sole rightful government of all Western kindred, and all kindred in all domains that it claims. Even if you don't live by the rules of the Camarilla, you are bound by them. If you transgress, they think they have every right to punish you. Formally, they function as a fraternal alliance between the princes of the various cities they control. And it is very much cities they control. Vampires don't really care about territory the way nations do. They see land as a resource, perhaps an investment, but what they seek control over is populations. That's where they stake their claims, and those happen to be in the cities. Vampires in the country attract too much attention, so they're excessively rare. The kindred are urban creatures. Now, unlike a fraternal alliance, the Camarilla funds itself and has its own institutions that conduct shadow wars and further the course and belief system that underlies the organization. Still, every city is different, and I think to understand how malleable the Camarilla is to the whims of every prince, we need to look at the local apparatus of power first. Every city is ruled by a prince. This much we all know. But is it really, strictly speaking, that way? Look, vampires require a certain base population level to sustain themselves in secret. There are various estimates of ratios that represent either a demographic reality or the Camarilla's ideal goal for a kindred to kind type deal. The most common number bandied about is 1 vampire for every 100,000 humans, with the conceit that this is a global average, and that it's a tighter ratio when it comes to major urban centers. I personally prefer a ratio of 1 to 50,000, even going so far as to say that very dense cities where embraces of new kindred run rampant might have a 1 in 10,000 ratio, but that's very personal to myself, and let me tell you, it's not that important. The reason for this isn't that every one vampire needs to drink 100,000 people, it's that vampires are desperately trying to remain hidden. The idea is that the overwhelming majority of kind will never, in their entire lives, come close to interacting with a vampire. That is how the Camarilla likes it. But if we go by the official number and take the metropolitan area as a basis for calculating all this, because obviously kindred don't really care about mortal administrative boundaries, there would be like 10 to 15 vampires in Glasgow. Kiel, the city where I live in Germany, rather a small town, would have 2.5. Going by my math and using like a sharper population concentration, you'd basically double that number and give it some upward mobility. I'd say 30 to 50 vampires sounds much better for Glasgow, and for a small city like Kiel, also just south of 10 works very well. That's, I think, more the reality you're gonna see reflected in most chronicles. But vampires are inherently rare. They are a refined lot. The truth is, of course, that any given city has as many vampires living in it as are needed to tell an interesting story. And that's the number you should go with, the amount of characters you need. Only the largest metropolises would have so many vampires that it would be impossible for pretty much all of them to at least know each other. Even if in practice they all spend very separate lives, tending to their particular businesses, interacting mostly with their ghouls and mortal servants, they will have met. What I mean to say is that especially with the recent popping up of more and more small cities, recent on like a somewhat historical time frame, that would support like maybe 5 or so vampires, there will either tend to be like a claim by a prince as part of their direct domain, or they will be ruled by someone designated by the prince as a sort of viceroy, though they will then often style themselves themselves prince as well, even if it's sort of a first among equals type arrangement, because there's like just a handful of guys there. There are large towns where there might be a single vampire, and they could call themselves prince, it's just that nobody would really care. The prince is whichever vampire can lay claim to a city effectively. Not in a legalistic way, but in terms of actual power. Heritage, primogeniture, being descended from the right kindred can be factors that cement your legitimacy as a prince of a city, but ultimately what matters is praxis. And praxis is the actual ability to control. Now, there's many ways that such control can look like, and some princes are much more secure in their power than others. An easy way is, of course, to be individually powerful, right? Having strong blood due to low generation and or many centuries of experience, both in terms of skill and supernatural abilities like disciplines. However, a degree of political acumen is still required. Especially when you are old and of thick blood, you may go into torpor somewhat frequently, and if you don't have powerful institutions in place, your city will fall to some upstart. Perhaps even the very regent you yourself installed. Of course, you may be able to reclaim it when you rise again, but who knows how the world will have changed at that point. Not to mention that potent blood makes for an excellent diablerie target. You will be someone's preferred snack. Many elders have no interest in ruling a city at all. They're happy to see a prince in place whom they support, though this support can also hurt that prince's legitimacy depending on how it plays. They may be seen as the puppet of a particular kingmaker, or maybe that's how they want to be seen. Given the importance of decorum in the Camarilla, it can be a little awkward when a 1,000-year-old elder doesn't bow deferentially to the 300-year-old prince at Elysium. If you want to be a prince, you need to control resources, meaning you need money and influence in the mortal institutions that define your city. If you want to be the Prince of New York, you need to have fingers in Wall Street. You need to have friends within, and you need to be able to leverage friends outside the city too. You'll at least need to not be offensive to your neighboring princes. The most important institutions you need to secure for yourself, however, are the clans. And in order to control the clans, you need to control the primogen. A primogen is the local leader of a clan in a given city. The name itself says that it is the eldest of the clan, and while that does often hold true, in actuality, it's like more the person with the most influence over a clan locally that holds the rank, not necessarily the eldest. Together, they form the Primogen Council, an advisory body meant to represent the interests of the clan to the prince, and which usually holds significant political power. In some cities, the Primogen act as a legislative body with actual authority to make policy, or even to command the prince at times. Usually, this isn't the case, except for minor things. But even when the council is only advisory, the prince needs to keep them happy, because these are the people best positioned to challenge their power. A good prince pleases their primogen to secure their loyalty and access to their resources, playing them out against each other, so most of them, or at least the most powerful ones, are invested in them remaining prince. Now, there are places where the prince themselves will appoint the primogen for each clan. This is usually a terrible idea because it will inevitably be seen as an act of tyranny and not place those with the most influence over their clans in charge. It's kind of hard to control those clans then. The prince is usually the primogen of their clan in that city, but that's not always the case. It might be that they need to satisfy a rival within their clan and create a separate position for them, or that votes on the council matter and the prince's clan can essentially give itself 2 votes that way. This also shows a way in which princes can meddle in the affairs of clans. When 2 or more people vie for the position of primogen, whom the prince does and does not meet with can make a huge difference. Some places have no primogen council at all, though it's still gonna be there, meeting in secret, plotting to overthrow the prince. Of course, of the 13 clans that exists, not all are always represented on every primogen council. In fact, that would be an extremely rare situation. More commonly, it's the 7 clans that are part of the Camarilla who hold seats. Though, of course, given the recent political development, that has quickly changed. Many cities who had Bruja or Gangrel Primogen for a very long time, and where members of that clan by and large stayed with the Camarilla, may still have Bruja and Gangrel Primogen. Similarly, it may take some time for every prince to recognize the authority of a La Sombra Primogen, and many areas in the West don't really have enough Banu Hakim for one of their number to become Primogen. If you're the only one of your clan in town, you're probably not going to be Primogen by default. You have no real power. This is why you'll never find a Tzimisce Primogen anywhere. They're just too rare in the Camarilla. On the other hand, a small bloodline with some degree of independence from its main clan that is particularly powerful or numerous in a given city might claim a Primogen seat. New Orleans, for instance, has at times had a Samedi Primogen. Not always, but it happens. Same thing with independent clans or groups that are not technically clans at all. There are cities with Giovanni, or rather Hecata these nights, Primogen. Particularly progressive princes have even had Caitiff, Thinblood, and Anarch Primogen from time to time. Well, there's a certain irony to being an Anarch Primogen. That kind of thing would have been unthinkable 100 years ago, and it's quickly becoming very rare again, but it happens. Now we come to the executive positions. Officers appointed and serving at the leisure of the prince. It's not uncommon for Primogen to hold these positions also, but usually princes will prefer to appoint people personally loyal to them, or at times even the most competent people for the job. Also, not all cities have these positions. Very few have all of them, just as very few have none at all. Running a city is hard and complicated work though, so a few of them are always represented, such as the sheriff. Often the de facto most important position after the prince, the sheriff's job is to keep the city safe and orderly, protect it against hostile action, and bring wrongdoers to justice. Some sheriffs have broad authority to do pretty much whatever they please, down to just destroying a law-breaking kindred on a whim, just like that. Others are closely monitored by their princes. Sheriffs tend to have deputies called hounds, usually appointed as the need arises, though some hounds are basically full-time. A few cities have more than one sheriff even, with bailiwicks split either by area of expertise or just territory. London, for instance, has at many points had 4 to 5 sheriffs. Closely related to the sheriff is the scourge. They used to be quite common in centuries past when they hunted caitiffs and thinbloods, ostensibly to prevent Gehenna. Now that the apocalypse has kinda sorta happened, they tend to be secret police, right? The killer who dispatches with the prince's personal enemies, usually reporting directly to them. Often this wouldn't really be an official position either, right? People would just refer to a person as the Scourge. Some Scourges are sort of a sheriff for fighting the Sabbat, or the person in charge of the actual fighting and action, where the sheriff is more concerned with investigating. In such arrangements, they tend to report to the sheriff rather than the prince, and the truth is that most of the duties of the Scourge are handled by sheriffs these days. Though generally Scourges have become outdated, things have changed since Prague, and many are back to their original purpose. An office nominally more powerful than the sheriff, but not nearly as common, is the seneschal. A seneschal is basically the hand of the prince. They run a significant portion of the state and speak with the prince's authority. This usually happens in large domains, domains where the prince is powerful but not very skilled, or maybe just not interested in matters of process and bureaucracy. Domains where the prince needs to secure a powerful political alliance with an effective diarch, or domains where the clan in charge is really trying to show how many powerful dignitaries they can produce. Many domains of ancient Methuselah have been factually ruled by their seneschals for a long time. And they are indeed in charge should the prince be indisposed, such as when they are in torpor for decades and centuries. Of course, a seneschal is also in an excellent position to overthrow a prince. A closely related position, to the extent that a person who holds one will usually also hold the other, is that of Keeper of the Elysium. Elysium is a meeting the prince can call that may be attended by all invited with no fear of hurt or reprisal while present or en route to and from. The use of disciplines, even social ones, is usually forbidden at Elysium. The Keeper's job isn't so much physical physical security, though they will usually coordinate with the sheriff on that front, but mainly in performing ceremonial duties and ferreting out opportunist rule breakers. Because it will basically mark you as a pariah for the rest of eternity to attack someone under the protection of Elysium, most such transgressions happen subtly and in situ. Usually the Keeper is told where Elysium is to be held by the prince at a certain time and location, though they are usually consulted in the process. Some cities have a permanent or regular Elysium space open to all, even non-kindred if they respect the rules. And some have several Elysia, in which case there's usually more than one Keeper. In very rare situations, the Keeper may not be appointed by the prince at all, but by the Primogen, or some other hereditary or selection mechanism. Though it is the prince's prerogative to call for Elysium, there are places where Primogen and even others can do so as well. This is usually seen as a sign of either a very weak or a very secure prince. Because of the innate limitations of vampire LARP, they actually have a concept there which therefore kinda does exist in Camarilla society at large, called a seance. Effectively a small Elysium for invited guests, where the same rules apply, but which lacks the authority of a prince. The herald is the prince's messenger and proclaimer. Walks 500 miles to deliver a message. When the powers that be make a decision, it is the herald's job to ensure everyone hears of it, which can be a tricky job considering the Camarilla uses no modern technology and is trying to remain secret from the world of mortals, so you can't use like newspapers either. You can't put just an ad in there. Of course, it can be politically convenient for the herald when certain people don't hear certain news. And for some folks, it just doesn't matter if they hear because they're simply not important enough. Heralds are also diplomats, often dispatched to other cities to negotiate on the prince's behalf. Most of the time, the duties of a herald are carried out by the seneschal, but particularly large domains need them. A harpy is a very nuanced position with many possible political roles. Usually it is an informal designation given to the court's foremost trendsetter and secret hawker, the Prince of Gossip, if you will. In such arrangements, there will sometimes be several harpies at court. Occasionally, a prince will appoint a harpy, which may piss off the other harpies something fierce. Then their duties become even more muddled. But they're usually the person people come to when they want to discuss unsavory business with the prince, but cannot approach them directly. They will also spy for the prince and/or spread particular political propaganda, which is why many harpies are official harpies that are never declared as such. It's also common for herald and harpy to be the same person. And finally, the Chancellor. Rather a rare office because it implies a certain weakness in the way vampire society works. That flawed foundational concept is of course prestation. Boons and favors owed, the endless web of agreements and IOUs between kindred on all levels of society. The absolute majority of boons are given without a chancellor's involvement. But it is technically their job to keep track of who owes whom, and to adjudicate in case of conflict. Big, important deals are usually made through a chancellor, but it's an office that needs everyone's trust to impartiality, and thus is usually not appointed by the prince, or rather it tends to be someone who's pretty much the only choice, and then the prince just makes it official. Because of course keeping lists like this is spicy information. Not to mention dangerous intelligence in the hands of hunters, which is one of the reasons why chancellors are very rare these days. Now there are other positions outside the ones mentioned here, but they tend to be unique to one, maybe two cities. Princes have pretty broad authority in how they shape their domain, and many domains have very particular idiosyncrasies that princes need to account for. There's all manner of strange local ways of doing things. Totalitarian domains to power-sharing arrangements between princes, it all exists. Such things are, of course, rare, and the Camarilla prefers not to see them. Even if they don't always enforce them, they have certain ideas as to how a city must be run, and will, at the very least, subtly influence things to bring everything up to code. And that code is known as the traditions, the 6 legal pillars of the Camarilla. They are the organization's entire raison d'etre, not just its most sacred constitution, but like the reasons with which it justifies its existence. Josiah may not explain much to you about what it means to be a vampire, but the Camarilla is going to make damn sure you know about the traditions. It might surprise you to hear that the Camarilla, instead of being like thousands of years old, has been around for barely 5 centuries. Although its way of doing things is much older than that. If you want to understand the historical historical context in which these international vampire politics are couched, you should check out this video's companion piece, where I do go over the traditions also, but this time accompanied by analysis focused on the reasons why they came about in the first place. First tradition, the Masquerade. Thou shalt not reveal thy true nature to those not of the blood. Doing such shall renounce thy claims of blood. And yes, I'm repeating all of them. This is going to be on the test. This is, of course, the big one, and the one the entire game is named after. The Masquerade is so important that even the organizations who see themselves as enemies of the Camarilla and specifically denounce its traditions tend to adhere to it. Revealing thy true nature, crucially, is not just telling people you're a vampire. In some places, you might even get away with doing that if it's part of your strategy for hiding, though I wouldn't press my luck on it. It's acting like a vampire and being seen by mortals, or doing it in a way that might be potentially seen by mortals. This means cameras, social media, public spaces, recurring social circles. This can be so strict that if you have any public presence at all, it is considered a breach. Even if you carefully curate your Instagram, people might notice that you're only ever out at night, and posting a photoshopped image of you during the day is the exact type of thing hunters will find suspicious. Stay in the same community for too long, they might notice you don't age. There is very little difference from city to city as to how strictly the Masquerade is enforced, as it's pretty much existential. But there are still nuances. For instance, your herd, mortals under your control which you drink from regularly. In some places, those are the people who should believe in vampires the least, while in others, it's considered somewhat acceptable for them to suspect something so long as they're devoted to you. Mortals who are blood bonded to you tend to be in positions in your life where they inevitably learn a thing or two about what's going on. And the loyalty created by the blood bond often makes that acceptable. However, if you are a prince's political opponent, they might still use it as an excuse to kill you. The only types of mortals that may learn pretty much anything a vampire could are ghouls, which arguably are not really mortal given that they don't age so long as they run on vampire blood. Although when that stops, they catch up quickly. But in cities where the Masquerade is especially strict, there might be limits even on that. The Camarilla as a whole does not use modern communications technology, ever. If you want to communicate, do it in person or use couriers. In some places, correspondence exchanged by such couriers must further be coded in some level of euphemism. In other places, and especially among young kindred, it's considered acceptable to own a landline, internet, maybe even a mobile phone so long as they're only used for non-kindred purposes. But that is rare. The punishment for breaking the Masquerade is rarely anything less than death. Second tradition, the domain. Thy domain is thine own concern. All others owe thee respect while in it. None may challenge thy word while in thy domain. The feudalist foundation of the organization, and also nonsense to a certain extent. The only vampire to which this truly applies is the prince. Your domain in a given city is only as unchallenged as the prince and the local elders decide. There are princes who will ask permission to step on your domain, but never forget that you have that domain by grace of the prince. And that sort of respect is usually only given to your haven, not the entirety of your territory. The main purpose of domains is to demarcate hunting grounds, and more crucially, areas of responsibility. When an area is your domain, it is your responsibility to ensure that the traditions are observed there. However, that does come with a claim to the local resources and the kind who work and or reside there, but that right is often more of a first dibs thing. Kindred have many different hunting strategies, so in practice, hunting grounds and domain become like overlapping but differently shaped concepts. Strict hunting grounds would be deleterious to the Masquerade, so the reality is that people will hunt and do business in your domain. It's gonna happen. But you are entitled to recompense, and you may ban them from doing so if they wrong you. Domain is not like a private property with a keep outside. If you control a city block full of nightclubs, kindred are going to come there to hunt, and you can profit off that. Banning them from doing so would only incentivize them to challenge your domain through their political inroads with the prince. A kindred wants to open a new new nightclub on your block, that's a great way to make money or get boons. But unless you have a good reason for not wanting them to do so, it'll be considered quite rude of you to arbitrarily restrict them. Domains are regularly subleased, creating a pyramid of landlords in every city, because the Camarilla is a feudalistic society. In most cities, domains are flexible titles held by individuals or groups of individuals. In many cities, domain is also held first and foremost by the clans, and you need to have standing with them in order to get any domain leased to you. Domain is not always necessarily defined by geography either, especially when it comes to hunting grounds. Individual kindred, coteries, or clans may have hunting charters that ignore domain boundaries or create overlapping jurisdictions. A coterie of bikers may have the highways of a city as their domain. The Hecata of a city may be entitled to feeding at every cemetery, and these areas can absolutely overlap, and more importantly, come into conflict. It always depends on the individual arrangement and the political standing of the players involved, which is why I think domain is one of the most underutilized political mechanics of the game. If you control these city blocks right here, you know, the ones that are out of frame, but some Nosferatu controls the sewers under those city blocks, and they pull someone down into that sewer to eat them there. Did they poach from your kind? They may not even have stepped onto your domain technically to do so. They might have just sort of reached over. Maybe the person was homeless and the Nosferatu in your city count the homeless to their domain. But they were still homeless in your city blocks. If you have more political power, they might have to compensate you. If they have more political power, you might lose your claim to the homeless in your own domain, but still be held responsible when somebody poaches them in a Masquerade offending manner. And what if I was to catfish someone who lives in your domain on the other side of town? This is the sort of bickering that creates centuries-long feuds. Who is in the right here might depend on arbitrage from above, but the prince's entire reason for giving you domain is so that domain can be thine own concern, and the prince just gets what you kick up. For many princes, these sorts of disputes represent a nice extra income stream, as everyone tries to please them. Luckily, the punishments for transgressing against domain, unless particularly egregious, or if you're in a situation where someone powerful is looking to make an example of you, tend not to be corporeal. You might owe money or blood or favors, usually significantly more than if you had just asked permission, but this really creates an incredible tapestry of political play that I just adore in this game. One of my favorite things about it. Third tradition, the progeny. Thou shalt only sire another with the permission of thine elder. If thou createst another without thine elder's leave, both thou and thy progeny shall be slain. This is about population control. The elders know that if you could, you would make all your friends and family into immortals also, within the first few years of stepping into this cruel and lonely world. They need to avoid the competition, and they need to cut you off from your usual support network so they can monopolize control over you. It's exceedingly rare for someone to be permitted to embrace a child before everyone they knew as a mortal is already dead. Now, it says that the people who could give you permission are your elders, but that means the prince. However, it is very common for the prince to sublet these permissions to the individual clans. For instance, by allocating this or that number of embraces to a given clan every decade or century, maybe even year, though I think that would be unlikely, in which case you'd have to ask your primogen. Many primogen actually expect this privilege because while the prince of course needs to keep the clans under control, they don't want a vampire prince from a different clan to decide whom they end up embracing on an individual basis, lest the prince never allow the best candidates to join a clan. Clan leaders are of course not interested in upsetting their own clan's balance of power either. Embracing a child creates a huge advantage for you. Embracing a mortal may also require additional permission from the person whose domain they live in. There's a lot of people involved who can be bribed and schmoozed into giving the process legitimacy. And while the punishment for transgressing is usually death for both, it's not at all uncommon for princes to spare the offspring, so long as someone else will claim them as their own, often saddling that person or clan with unfortunate and unexpected responsibility while demonstrating their own magnanimity or creating an agent loyal to them. This is what happens at the beginning of the original Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game. Though of course the prince is not a very good schemer and it ends up biting him in the ass. A weird edge case for this tradition can occur when a prince sanctions an embrace but the primogen of a clan doesn't. They then legally have every right to exist, but their clan will not accept them, and may even shun their sire. This will also significantly strain the relationship between the prince and that primogen. Fourth tradition, the accounting. Those thou create are thine own children. Until thy progeny shall be released, thou shalt command them in all things. Their sins are thine to endure. In most cities, new embraces must be trained to live as kindred, and only become legitimized when presented at court. Usually there is then a separate ceremony happening much later, where they are released from the property of their sire to be their own person and make their own decisions. Legally, until they are released, you and your child are essentially the same person, but you are the senior, the one who makes the decisions. The whole "their sins are thine to endure" thing is really not that simple, though. Very often when child transgress a little, it's just let slide because they're expected to do that. Unless it's pretty bad, in which case what happens to them really depends on their sire. They may be destroyed and their sire gets a slap on the wrist, but there are princes who are very serious about the fourth tradition and may not just impose the exact same punishment on the sire, but worse. Of course, even after a child is released, they usually remain bound to their sire and the ecosystem of their clan by blood, law, social enmeshment, boons, and property. Occasionally even love, or something resembling it. The whole process usually takes between 10 and 20 years, though it can be longer or shorter. Basically, at the point at which you are released, you are no longer just a fledgling, but a neonate, and thine sins become thine own to endure. Fifth tradition, the hospitality. Honor one another's domain. When thou comest to a foreign city, thou shalt present thyself to the one who ruleth there. Without the word of acceptance, thou art nothing. Look, yes, they should have made this the third tradition. Right, this change in topic just to come back to domain again, it irritates me as well. This law is there to make sure people don't try to be clever when attempting to get around the laws of the night unseen. And what it usually means is that when you come to a city, you need to let the prince know that you are there. What this looks like can vary, right? Some princes require you to arrive on a certain day, made out in advance, to present yourself at court with the sheriff, the seneschal, and at least half the primogen present. In other cities, if you're staying longer than a week, you need to chuck a note stating your clan and name into a post box that someone sends an intern to collect every couple days. Usually it's enough to show up at the next regular Elysium and say hi. In some cities, you need to present yourself to the primogen of your clan instead of the prince, and they have a responsibility to let the prince know you are there. Makes sense because usually they would be your first contact in any given city. There's even princes who just do not give a fuck. But those are incredibly rare. What this doesn't mean is that you need to figure out who controls every city block as you drive downtown and let them know you're passing through. Sometimes this is not even necessary when you hunt in someone's domain. If you want to do business there though, or establish some sort of permanent presence, you must say something, even when it is your right. Which it isn't always. It often depends on the laws of the city and the laws of the particular vampire in charge of that domain, as well as how much they can enforce those rules. As above, so below. This is the compromise of secrecy, and not all kindred respect this law. Some manage to live for decades in the heart of a domain without anyone knowing. The Chiasids are infamous for this. Usually when you fail to present yourself, if you have a good reason as to why you didn't know the local protocols, and you can demonstrate that you did your utmost to discover them, you'll be fine. If not, this alone could get you banished and seriously complicate your ability to enter other cities in the future. If, on the other hand, you commit a crime while not being known to the relevant authorities, your punishment will be much harsher than it would have been if you'd committed that crime while known. Sixth tradition, the destruction. Thou art forbidden to destroy another of thy kind. The right of destruction belongeth only to thine elder. Only the eldest among thee shall call the blood hunt. This may be the sixth law, but I hold that it may be the most important one in terms of gameplay, certainly. You're not allowed to just kill other vampires. It's illegal. Unless, of course, you're powerful. Usually, the only person allowed to sentence someone to death in a domain is the prince. When you're a fledgling, your sire may also do so at any time, though this isn't the case everywhere. The sheriff can, of course, also often do this as an agent of the prince, and the seneschal as well, and there are places where even Primogen can destroy anyone within their own clan, with or without good reason. There are specific legal situations where you might be entitled to kill another kindred in some places, such as trespassers in your haven, even poachers in some areas, and of course, good old-fashioned self-defense. But depending on your personal standing, there's no guarantees. The blood hunt is a practice which declares that everyone has the right to destroy a certain kindred. Blood hunts can usually only be called by the prince, and some princes even have it set up so that a majority of the Primogen Council need to vote in favor also. There's usually a time limit on a blood hunt, and they're often used to drive people out of a city. Because conflict is dangerous, most blood hunts only attract many participants if they involve sanctioned diablerie. If you don't know, diablerie is the drinking of a vampire's heartblood, the consumption of their soul, which will empower your own blood. This is usually a big no-no in the Camarilla. It's much worse than just killing a kindred. And though it is not explicitly stated in the wording of this tradition, the sixth tradition does in practice ban diablerie doubly so. If there's no sanctioned diablerie at the blood hunt, pretty much only fools and people who hold a grudge against that vampire will show up to it, which can be a nice tool to harass a political opponent. So yeah, the laws of the kindred world are ambiguous and ultimately propped up by power. Every city is different, and that's a good thing. It would be terribly boring if the Camarilla was like an entirely procedural society. Process is to be used as a weapon. That's half the fun of the game. Now, there is another tradition, but it's an unwritten one. The seventh of the six, if you will. Humanity. All kindred are cursed with the beast, the blood parasite that has hijacked their soul while granting them eternal life and unimaginable power. The beast is intelligent, but it is a monster. It's always trying to take more, always trying to claw its way deeper, shredding more and more of what makes a vampire a thinking being, and plunging them toward an instinctive, monstrous state that can never be returned from. Kindred need to learn to keep their beast under control, stop it from devouring them from within. And in the Camarilla, the only acceptable way of doing this is by holding on to your humanity. Yes, humans are food. We call them kind for a reason. But they are not saddled with the beast as we are. They can be our lodestar. Whenever your beast drives you to do something irredeemable, ask yourself, what would I do if I was still human? Now, aside from some semi-universal precepts, visions of what it means to be human can diverge rather drastically. You've met a few humans, I am assuming. You know they have very different beliefs and opinions about stuff. Camarilla kindred seek never to forget who they were. And if who they were was callous and cruel, then that's who they were. So long as they can justify that callousness and cruelty as virtuous, it will protect them from the beast. Though, of course, being evil and selfish at heart is as much a slippery slope as being a genuine Samaritan, in which case existence as a vampire maybe just isn't for you. Should have been a magus, or a werewolf, or a changeling. The tragedy of the downward spiral is also one of the core gameplay elements of Vampire the Masquerade. In a way, it is the one thing the game is about. The inevitable loss of your humanity as your touchstones die and the world changes in ways that makes it so no one holds your values anymore. Can you adapt? Maybe. But it's dangerous. You never know if it's the beast leading you down that path. But okay, we've spent a lot of time now understanding the local and how diverse it can be. What about the international? One of my favorite movies, in fact. For some reason, when I was 17, I was really into international banking crime. What happens above the prince? What are the machinations within the upper spires of the Ivory Tower? Mostly it's the obscure Camarilla leadership conducting aforementioned shadow warfare against the other sect, making sure princes toe the line, and being themselves instrumentalized by powerful princes and elders to secure their personal power. The main agents carrying out this work are known as Archons, the roving rangers of the Camarilla, who usually travel from city to monitor the goings-on, conduct investigations, and do the whole warfare bit against the Sabbat. Though they do not technically outrank princes and are expected to abide by their laws, the moment doing so would interfere with their mission, they get to do pretty much whatever they want. And Archons are pretty good at finding reasons why obeying the local law would be deleterious to their mission. Even without outranking anyone, they carry the voice and authority of the Camarilla at large, and can seize resources, access restricted areas, punish, even kill kindred as they deem righteous. Though rarely entirely without consequences, an Archon who oversteps is not going to make the prince very happy, and you don't become prince by not being powerful. The classic situation in which an Archon shows up in a city is when there is chaos and disorder caused by an unruly populace or outside agitators in order to help the prince restore order. This is, in fact, a very bad look for a prince, and it is going to do long-lasting damage to the legitimacy of their reign if they survive it at all. It's not uncommon for an Archon to decide that the prince's incompetence is the root of the issue and replace them with someone they deem more fit. But this whole scenario doesn't actually happen all that often. Most of what Archons do is intelligence work, surgical strike operations. Most princes do prefer to know if an Archon is operating in their domain, but they'll ask them to keep their rank secret, so as to not appear weak in front of their subjects, which they probably would even if the reason the Archon is there has nothing to do with the strength of the prince. You just don't want people talking. Many Archons work entirely undercover and have no intention of revealing themselves to anyone, often because they were sent precisely to spy on the prince of a city, or some other group the Camarilla deems in need of observation. In fact, there are many Archons who entirely replace a suspicious person, assuming their identity to play out the field, or sometimes even infiltrate the very depths of rival sects. As you can imagine, Archons lead extremely dangerous unlives, often going up against implacable enemies, always at risk of final death through the awkward power of secrecy and miscommunication. In other words, if you want to run a high-level, high-stakes international vampire action hero campaign, Archons as player characters is the ideal way to go. While most of them work alone, many also work in small teams, and even the loners tend to deputize so-called servires to assist them. Though they, of course, carry much less of the innate authority of Archons, as anyone who just happens to be in the right place at the right time with the right kind of expertise may be among their ranks for a while. Long-serving or particularly able servires, however, may have a chance of becoming Archons themselves one night. Though Archons have always been tasked with a range of missions, there are several special types of Archon that specialize in particular fields or are vested with exceptional authority. Josians specialize in tracking down and destroying infernalists and other unsavory demon cultists, as well as recently various Nodist and Gehenna cults that threaten the theological integrity of the Camarilla. Given how prevalent Nodist thinking has become in the Ivory Tower in recent decades, they seem not to have done a very good job, or been quite tragically misled. Quasitors are similar except specializing in sorcery of all kinds, using their magical expertise to deal with everything from Tzimitzi Kolduns to mortal mages. The majority of them are unsurprisingly Tremere, and because of this, they are distrusted. It's kind of assumed that this is the clan of warlocks leveraging its magical monopoly to basically get a whole branch of Archons to themselves that'll serve the interests of their clan over the Camarilla. They've been getting away with it. E-Division is a fairly new organization created by forward-thinking elders and staffed primarily with a Servires roster of fairly young vampires, serving some particularly open-minded Archons. In fact, the average age is so low that, internally they often just call themselves the X-Files, and it's their job to gather information and create risk assessments about everything weird and unknown, of which there is, of course, very, very much in the world of darkness. purpose. Mostly this means they go around the world interviewing elders on knowledge they have acquired over the centuries about mysterious creatures like mummies and fairies, and looking if that still tracks with their modern incarnations. But there's also entirely new scary frontiers, like cyberspace, that they're supposed to explore. Where other archons are bound to the laws of princes, Alistors are uniquely exalted in that absolutely no kindred laws apply to them at all. They can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And the reason for this is that they are tasked with hunting down the anathema, the names on the Camarilla's red list. You can think of it as the FBI most wanted list, except secret, existing only in the form of rumors. The people on the list itself don't know for sure whether they're on it, often much to their chagrin because they'd like to use it as a sort of ranking system for who is a greater enemy to the Camarilla. These are some of the worst monsters the world of vampires has ever spawned. Criminals whom it will never be permissible to negotiate or entreaties with. You will not even find the Sabbat leadership on there. Yes, select people among them, absolutely. People who are affiliated with them, sometimes. But mostly the red list is full of terrorists, traitors, and people who are trying to mess with the idea of vampire kind itself in fundamental ways. You have folks like Cloakina, a Nosferatu bioterrorist who turned the Black Death into a kindred plague and started deliberately infecting people. Dylan Bruce, a young Ventru who somewhat unwittingly became a conduit for the demon Tiamat. And Kementiri, who to my knowledge is the only vampire to come back from being a mindless wight and now seeks nothing less than the destruction of all kindred. Also, like Count Dracula, she's immune to the blood bond. Though they are a secret branch among the Archons, at this point, everyone knows about the Alistors, and fears the impunity with which they act. And finally, we have Praetors, the Archons among Archons. Most exalted and distinguished veterans, some having served as Archons for centuries, which, given that they have a life expectancy of a few decades at most, is genuinely incredible. Praetors are still Archons, but they have authority over other Archons, and can usually requisition them as they see fit. They tend to be concerned with long-term projects, sort of the ultimate technocrats of the Camarilla, singular in their focus of implementing major strategic operations. Notably, the whole thing of it being a terrible look for a prince when an Archon shows up is almost the opposite when that Archon is a Praetor. In which case it usually turns into, wow, our prince's domain is so important that the Camarilla sends like this level of resources to support us? Usually the title only holds for as long as that project is underway, but it's pretty common for an Archon to keep it after that, in an informal capacity. When several Archons work together on a project, they also tend to designate a Praetor among them, which is more of a sign of seniority, not the same as having the official title. Because Praetors are not the ones who command the Archons. That privilege goes to the Justicars. They are the boss cops of the Camarilla, the executive directors, the 4-star generals. Unmatched in formal authority. They're elected every 13 years, with each clan nominating one of their own number, usually someone with immense power and sway within that clan's senior leadership, and ideally someone who at least spent some time working as an Archon. Justicars are the people who create Archons, and they can strip them of that privilege as well. Every Archon serves a particular Justicar, and is often tied to their career, though it's not unheard of that new Justicars inherit old Archons, or that they are even traded. These Archons are often of the same clan of the Justicar in question, but really members of any clan, even non-Camarilla clans, can and frequently do become Archons to any Justicar. It is an immense honor and privilege to be nominated Justicar, but it does tie up a kindred's resources quite a bit when they're retasked entirely with enforcing the will of the Ivory Tower. It's a less deadly profession than Archon, but not by much, which is why some people have, in the past, rejected such a nomination. Like, for instance, the Ventru elder Johannes Castelline, whom I mention here solely because he's one of my VTM Blorbos. For many influential leaders, serving a few terms as Justicar is the final stepping stone to truly being at the very top of their clan, while for others, it is a calling they never wish to abandon again. There are currently 5 Justicars: Diana Iodanza for Clan Toreador, Ian Carfax for Clan Tremere, Juliet Parr for Clan Malkavian, Lucinda for Clan Ventru, and Molly MacDonald for Clan Nosferatu. Though it ought to be noted that these guys were elected in 2011, and 13 years after 2011 was 2024, so who knows if this list is current? I mean, Lucinda's definitely have another go. The Ventru nominated her as Justicar for Unlife. But who knows about the others? 5 may strike you as a rather small number if you consider that there are 13 clans. But of course, even knowing that not all clans are formally members of the Camarilla, you might still reckon that 5 is maybe a little low. And this is because in 2011, 2 more Justicars were appointed. Geoffrey Lay for Clan Gangrel and Manuela Cardoso Pinto for Clan Bruja. But both of these clans have since formally cut ties with the Camarilla in a series of massive upsets. If you want to find out more about that, I shall once again refer you to my The Secret History of Vampires video. But that's basically why we only have 5 Justicars right now, though of course the La Sombra may get a Justicar of their own soon. It may have already happened. And since the Camarilla has entered into a pact with the organization known as the Ashira, they might get a Justicar in spite of not technically being a clan, though it would inevitably be a Justicar of Clan Banu Hakim. There have been talks of appointing a Justicar for the assorted kindred in the Camarilla who were not part of any of the 5 clans. A very inclusion-focused move in a rapidly changing ivory tower that seems to have realized that if you claim to be the rightful government of all kindred, you might want to give them all a seat at the table at least. Though of course only a child would think that this is truly the reason why the Camarilla exists. Above the Justicars is the Inner Circle, that mysterious and exclusive group of ancient power brokers that are openly secret. Everyone who knows the greater power structure of the Camarilla knows about the Inner Circle. The Justicars are their official representatives, but the shadowy cabal at the top is the official, recognized head of state. And nobody knows who the Inner Circle is. Their identities are secret. Now, of course, we can venture a guess. There were 7 clans in the original Camarilla, and you might say that there were 7 particular vampires who founded the Camarilla by orchestrating the Convention of Thorns. Those were, after all, the first Justicars, who eventually recused themselves into obscurity at the exact moment the Inner Circle anonymously popped into existence, and a new generation of Justicars was elected to serve at the behest of that Inner Circle. This would mean that the Inner Circle comprises Adana da Sforza for Clan Bruja, Camilla Baines for Clan Malkavian, Halderstadt for Clan Ventru, Josef von Bauren for Clan Nosferatu, Milov Petrenkov for Clan Gangrel, Mistress Fonchon for Clan Tremere, and Rafael de Corazon for Clan Toreador. Yes, that is his real name. Everyone refers to them as the 7. So it's gotta be them, right? Yeah, well, Milov Petrenkov became kind of a roving monstrosity a few centuries ago. Camilla Baines is obsessed with resurrecting Cappadocius. Adana da Sforza is too concerned with rebuilding Carthage in America to have time for anything else. And no one has heard a peep out of Josef von Bauren ever since the Second Inquisition burned Munich to the ground. Oh, and of course, Halderstad famously is dead. He was killed by a rogue Archon. He is not alive anymore. And let's be serious, who knows how many of these characters ever existed or are considered full canon in 5th edition? Maybe they were made up entirely by elders and Methuselah as sort of youthful papier-mâché puppets to hide the fact that they are the ones still pulling the strings in the ivory tower. Is the Inner Circle even real? Is it a collective hallucination of the clan elders? Or are they aware of it being nothing more than a fairy tale? If it is real, did Adana leave with the rest of her clan? Did Milov get replaced with a different gangrel? And if so, did they leave the Camarilla? Was anyone added or subtracted from the Inner Circle at some point? Is it even as formal an organization as we assume? Are there members from non-Camarilla clans in there? Personally, I am fairly certain that the La Sombra Montano, one of the oldest vampires alive at roughly 8,000 years, and very much an adherent of the sort of feudal order the Camarilla has always espoused, is in there. It certainly would explain why the La Sombra's integration into the Camarilla seems to be happening at such an expedited pace. For that matter, why does it need to be 7 people? It strikes me as rather suspicious that everyone refers to them as the 7 so insistently when there is absolutely no way of confirming that. Why not 5 or 10? Or 13? Why not 1? Maybe I was wrong earlier. Maybe there is a singular king or queen of vampires, and that person is the entirety of the inner circle. This level of obfuscation is, again, by design. The game wants to give each individual group the option of running things the way that makes the most sense for them, creating these mystical tapestries that make it all seem more than a bunch of blood-sucking monsters hiding from their own inhumanity, and the ennui of eternal existence. But of course, the Camarilla is more than just its police and military institutions. It's the ancient networks of agreements and relationships that span centuries and continents. Rivalries formed over slights committed in nations no one speaks the language of anymore. Friendships and love forged in the face of an eternity steeped in such evil that it has mutated them into bizarre simulacra of true emotion. Many of the most powerful people in the Camarilla, the people whose word truly is universal law, haven't held any particular rank in centuries. They just have the contacts, the resources, and the projects. There's organizations that transcend cities and often sects, like the numerous secretive blood cults that exist within the Camarilla, revealing this sort of ancient Roman heritage that it clearly has. Of course, the dark gods they worship there are quite real, and some don't even feel like they're worshipping at all. They have a personal relationship with their god. The Methuselah does, after all, whisper to them in the night. Of course, the official position of the Camarilla is that such things are blasphemous. It takes kindred from the path of humanity, the great idol and servant of the ivory tower, toward thinking that vampires can exist as more than people. But who's gonna stop these cults when their leaders are among the most powerful elders in the sect, and they serve to keep the subjects loyal? When do they really start leading the whole edifice astray? Will the fact that they're all pulling in different directions keep the ivory tower from toppling? Conspiracies within conspiracies. It doesn't matter what you do. You are never a free agent. You are always part of a plot by some elder you have never even met. And never will either. And they're controlled by an even older elder who is even more secretive. The Camarilla, of course, officially denies the existence of the Jihad. They say that that's like a stupid Sabbat story. They say vampires do organize themselves and the old ones are just the wisest ones, so we should follow their advice, clearly. They even deny the existence of the antediluvian founders of the 13 clans. But in a quite extraordinary turn of events, probably on account of the turmoil the sect finds itself in, this policy has started changing at the highest level. Not explicitly, the party line is still no, they don't exist, but they are adding another contradiction. Now we say, yeah, maybe it is possible that there are antediluvians, but if so, they are just the most wisest of the elders. They should be respected more than anyone. But are they real? Are they active? Is that the true inner circle? Is it an even innerer circle? If it's not the antediluvians, it's the Inconnu, or the Tal Meira, or the leaders of the blood cults, or any number of entities no one has ever heard of. And look, here's the thing. It's easy to see shadows in the dark, especially when you have been conditioned in your new life to be paranoid. There's a beast living in your soul that is constantly terrified. I am sure that these eldest puppet masters exist, and they are plotting, and their decisions have an impact on the world. But you gotta ask yourself, how many of these manipulative elders are just sitting in their dark caverns every night, believing themselves to be the ultimate chess masters, because they are so inundated with information provided by sycophants and thralls trying to please them that they can see any pattern they want in the happenings of the world, and declare that it is all going according to plan. These are immortal creatures. Everyone might be biding their time so much that nothing ever happens, deluding themselves that they are in complete control when in fact they just give a little nudge here and there. The real power, the power felt on the ground, lives in the Camarilla's self-righteous authoritarianism. Before we move on, I need to level with you for a moment and say that massive double feature undertakings like this one would never be possible without the support of my generous Patreon patrons. I just wouldn't be able to do this, right? I would have to chase the maximum algorithm optimization all the time. This provides me with the security that allows me to not phone it in like that. There's a number of cool rewards you can get over there, like joining in on my weekly live streams as a guest, seeing me team up with friends and loved covers to provide commentary on certain shows, and of course, being on the credit slate of all my videos. If you want to help me make content for the future, please consider chipping in for a few bucks a month over there. I would very much appreciate it. Put it at the top of the description. And now back to the show. The main resistance to the Camarilla's self-righteous authoritarianism comes from the Anarchs. For a long time, Anarchs and their ways were tolerated on the fringes of Camarilla cities, and in whichever domains they claimed that the Camarilla had no interest in. But ever since 2012, the Anarchs and the Camarilla are at war. Many say that this is because with the shattered Sabbat, the Camarilla needed a new enemy. But Anarchs did kill some of the Camarilla's senior-most leadership, and the Sabbat is still around, as useful a political boogeyman as ever. The real truth is that this is a high-minded ideological conflict between geopolitically relevant Camarilla elders and the greatest Anarch luminaries and traitors of the Ivory Tower. On a local scale, yes, many powerful princes took it as a reason to grab more praxis and impose new and draconian laws. But the truth about the Anarchs is, though they have a few cities, few of them tend to be prestigious, and most Anarchs actually just do live in the shadow of the Ivory Tower, tolerated in the least desirable domains of Camarilla metropolises. Anarchs don't think of power and control the way the Camarilla does, and so Anarchs are everywhere. They're a useful outlet to keep in reserve too, letting raucous childer blow off some steam before they realize their life is much easier and less dangerous sticking with their sire. Nobody wants the places the Anarchs claim anyway, and while the Anarchs are there, at least they will make it harder for the Sabbat to take hold. Plus, they make for potential recruits in times of war. And yes, the Anarchs dislike the Camarilla, many even hate it, but most have an even greater distaste for the Sabbat, and the Camarilla has deep pockets and long arms in times of crisis. Anarch domains are as diverse and colorful as the movement itself. There is no one template on how they are run, but they are certainly not all run in line with what modern humans would call like a socialist or anarchist ideology. Most of them, at least. The two most successful Anarch projects were the Anarch Free State in California and the Soviet Union. Neither of these exists anymore, of course, at least not to the extent of their former glory, but they significantly influenced many Anarch domains in America and Europe respectively. The Anarch Free State was ruled by barons. This may seem a bit ironic, because it is, but they named themselves this to differentiate themselves from princes, and they did this with a good deal of irony. Barons control much smaller territories than princes. In a given city, you will always have a number of barons, and they will tend to form a senior council where citywide affairs are discussed and decided. Some of these meetings anyone can attend, other times they're secret, which unfortunately just has become necessary, especially in an era where the Camarilla likes its surgical strikes. Barons may be people who see themselves as first among equals, seeking to mediate conflicts in their domain and ensure the safety of all those who live in it. Humans may or may not be included in that. Some see themselves as ideological thought leaders, less concerned with territory than with having the respect of other Anarchs and exerting their influence that way. Others understand themselves as sober elders who watch the rowdy kids while they enjoy their freedom, sometimes needing a firm hand when they're about to do something stupid, but ideally interfering as little as possible. Even others are stewards and administrators of the land. They feel like they have been elected to the position, keeping order for the good of all, and are compensated for this with some obolus of rent by visitors and tenants. And of course, there are those who are just warlords itching for territory, always looking to expand and control. However, these kinds of guys are rarely popular with Anarchs and tend to see the sun quicker than most. The American Anarch model emphasizes individualism and freedom. Many of them actually live on the road. Anarchs form gangs that claim turf and negotiate with those who want to stay there, though they usually don't mind anyone so long as they don't make trouble. And hell, maybe there's someone who's fun to hang out with. Because of how rare kindred are, there is ultimately enough blood to go around. Most Anarchs consider the Masquerade useful, even if they find it ideologically objectionable. But those who don't respect it rarely survive for very long. When someone overgrazes or mass embraces or just unlives in too obvious a manner, the other Anarchs in a given area will usually seek counsel with one another and put an end to it. It being illegal to kill a vampire is Camarilla law, Anarchs need to be able to take action when something is wrong. In a sense, there is an arrogance to many Anarchs that you won't even find in the Camarilla. They think they are the toughest and most virtuous for braving the dangers of Anarch life and not becoming monsters, not realizing how monstrous they have become. In Europe, especially Eastern Europe, where the Bruja-led Soviet Anarchs controlled and many would say corrupted the Union and its ideals, freedom tends to be a little more collectivist. Like their Soviet predecessors, European Anarchs convene councils, where they may or may not elect leaders and form committees to deal with the particular problems in their cities. It's less law of the jungle and more ideological adherence to the idea of the equality of all kindred involved. A difficult reality to conceive of when you look at the gulf of power between a 500-year-old of the 7th generation and a lick from last week whose blood is barely thick enough to draw the sun's ire. So in practice, leaders emerge, and because kindred are driven by a scared and greedy beast, and there is little room for oversight, they tend to bend the rules and use personal influence to get what they think is best for the community. The city is not seen as just a great big hunting ground, but a common resource everyone must do their part in cultivating. Thus, these Anarchs are often deeply embedded in mortal institutions, and it's sometimes hard to tell where their councils end and the councils of humans begin. In the Soviet Union, of course, they were explicitly integrated, and much of this stems from the ideals of Carthage, where humans and vampires lived side by side as equals with different roles, allegedly. Sure, many Anarchs believe that humans are almost as valuable as kindred, but others really don't see humans as more than cattle. And though emulating humanity as a way of staving off the beast is common, many adhere to different moral frameworks as well. Anarchs live in the fringes of society for pragmatic reasons. They are, in a sense, part of human society, and so hunters who look for shadowy masters pulling the strings from a distance often overlook them. They use technology, they have internet forums, and though of course they do all this carefully, there are huge advantages to it, even Masquerade-wise. It's weird to be someone without social media presence today. Of course, that tactic can easily backfire, so the Anarchs are often victims of the Second Inquisition. But while their unlives tend to involve a lot of violence, Anarchs prefer to discuss how to solve problems first. They value diplomacy even with their sworn enemies, because they all have skin in the game. Few Anarchs are so wealthy and powerful that they could entirely insulate themselves from the losses if war were to break out, so they seek to avoid it. Unlike Camarilla princes, who tend to control faceless armies of expendables, when Anarchs go to war, it's they themselves and their friends that they put at risk. Ironically, in terms of global Camarilla-Anarch conflict, their low numbers and meager resources means that they are not effective at waging war against the Ivory Tower, nor do they really want to. But when they do strike, such as at the Conclave of Prague, they can do immense damage to these centralized powerhouses. Whereas the Camarilla can strike and strike and strike and never hit anything important. For centuries, the Camarilla has tried to CIA the Anarchs, spending a lot of resources sabotaging everything they do so they can say, look, it doesn't work. Infiltrating their ranks and occasionally taking out their most effective people to create the sort of paranoia that will eat away at the fabric of trust that people need to work together. And even though the Anarchs know this, it's been very successful at keeping them down. But they're so remarkably diverse that it will never destroy them. There are Anarch groups who function as pirate crews, where everyone owns whatever version of the ship is together. They share all the spoils, but they do elect certain positions that require everyone's trust in someone's judgment and qualifications. There are cults out there of maybe a triumvirate of blood gods, who grant boons to mortals who give them offerings. There are communes with no leaders, where everyone does everything or people have their agreed upon areas, and they vote on issues of mutual import like defense. There are businesses where vampires and humans work side by side somewhat openly, and the vampires offer money for blood, consent style. There are tribes of a single bloodline deep in the wilderness preying on human trespassers. What you definitely should not make the mistake of doing is think that the Anarchs are somehow utopian societies where things go right even most of the time. Anarchs are monsters. It came free with their being a vampire. and they are as self-righteous, stupid, and cruel as anyone. The way they're embedded in human society instead of existing at a certain remove confronts them with decisions that the Camarilla knows better than to allow fledglings and neonates to make. When you live surrounded by your loved ones, it's them whom you will need to keep quiet when you slip up. They'll also be the ones in your reach when you frenzy unexpectedly. Anarchs are faced with daily dilemmas, and that is also one of the reasons why they are not a global geopolitical concern. Even after the Brujah and Gangrel officially joined the Anarchs, nothing much changed there. If anything, it made things more complicated. Many people throwing off the shackles of oppression, joining the fringes of the world, unaware that they don't know how to live without them. And the fear is that many of them will be driven to even greater extremes. Such as, of course, the Sabbat, the Sword of Cain, the only real vampires in town. If you want to understand the Sabbat, think of them as all the most militant, fanatical organization of every religion and ideology. ISIS, the SS, Evangelical Nationalist Militias, the Committee of Public Safety, the NKVD, the Khmer Rouge, all tightly bound into the corset of the Catholic Church in Crusade times. They are a very diverse group of incorrigible extremists, united by shared access to certain magical rituals, a common heritage as vampires, and the grand goal of slaying the vampire elders and their antediluvian masters. The Sabbat is at war with everything, and it sees itself as the avenging army of the Dark Father Cain, or Lilith, or someone else, or neither, or some outside entity, and not an avenging sword, a conquering sword. And not a sword, but a scimitar, a pike, a crossbow, a fucking grenade launcher. The Sabbat is many things to many of its members, and always has been. There's a huge number of different modes of thought in there, ranging from roving packs of cannibals, to disciplined war squads, to cults of personality. They all eschew the notion of humanity as the guiding principle to their actions, and they have developed a variety of paths of enlightenment as moral frameworks to hold the beast at bay. Visions of what a vampire should be. These paths are often defined by their inhumanity and incomprehensibility by anyone who doesn't subscribe to them. There's truly an enormous amount of them, and they all believe that they are the sole truth. Well, not all of them, but certainly most of them. There are those who believe vampires are wild predatory animals who should run in nature. Those who see vampires as dark Templars bound by their word of honor. Those who see the vampiric condition itself as a canvas to be transformed. Those who believe vampires should rule humans as tyrants. Those who believe that utter submission to the will of the Dark Father will bring liberation. And many, many more. They are fascists of every stripe. The most influential and important paths right now, which you might call the factions of the Sabbat as well, are the Nodists, also known as the Path of Cain, whose primary goal is to bring their blood as close to the blood of Cain as possible by drinking as much vitae as possible. Especially the powerful and delectable vitae of other, preferably older vampires, which they diablerize with glee. Albigensians, also known as the Path of Cathari, were defined in opposition to a specific medieval religious movement advocating for temperance and abstention. Instead, the Cathari view themselves as demons of vice, and the beast as a means of achieving unspeakable pleasure while engaged in dark indulgences beyond human comprehension. The Necronomists, also known as the Path of Death and the Soul, are almost intellectual, focusing on the scholarly investigations of death, and killing as much as possible to understand, just the act, so that when one day the antediluvians are killed, they will be killed for good, which is not a terrible consideration to make, honestly. The Unifiers, also known as the Path of Power and the Inner Voice, seek nothing but dominance, even over themselves and their beast. Power is the only thing that matters, and it lies in hierarchy and control over your inferiors, which must be slavishly devoted to you. These are far from the only paths that exist, and which many Sabbats still follow. There's Metamorphosis, Honorable Accord, Feral Heart. The list is long. They have a wiki where they list them. And many people outside the Sabbat also follow paths, some even within the Camarilla, though they have to work hard to keep that secret. Some are tolerant of others, or at least certain others, seeing them as strays who will find the truth eventually, or as useful tools to be exploited. It's an organization characterized by turmoil. And right now, it is not in good shape. In my The Secret History of Vampires video, I go over how it came about and why it is currently on the brink of destruction, when in the 90s it was able to pull itself together to the extent that it managed to fight and almost win a massive war against the Camarilla. A Camarilla that was always superior in numbers and power. The core social unit of the Sabbat, what in the Camarilla is the coterie, is the pack. A group of Sabbat who have rejected the concept of clan and bound themselves to one another. The Sabbat practices a ritual called Voldery, which breaks all previous blood bonds and blood binds each member of the pack to every other. The blood bond of Voldery is not quite as intense, but it does its job. It creates units of soldiers who care for one another from the very beginning. Sabbat packs are always their own little thing, but they tend to have a ductus, a commanding officer who is often more of a first among equals type guy, and a priest, the spiritual head of the group, who keeps morale up and proselytizes the ideology of whatever corner of the Sabbat the pack happens to be in. Sabbat packs don't usually come together voluntarily. They're not a found family. They are a group of people you are forced to love. Much like when a prince or like some other group of elders decides that there should be a coterie for a particular purpose. Sabbat leaders do the same, usually with new recruits, who can come from new embraces, brainwashed Camarilla abductees, and occasionally volunteers. Of course, the majority of new Sabbat embraces are shovelheads. When the Sabbat besieges a mortal city, they will usually abduct a number of mortals, mass embrace them, and throw them in a grave that they need to dig themselves out of. Hence the name Shovelhead. These frenzied shock troops are then sent into the fray, usually the first to be killed, and that's really all they're good for. The Sabbat may be vampire supremacists, but not every one of their embraces is sacred. In the rare cases when Shovelheads survive, they may be inducted as proper members of the sect, graduating from false Sabbat to true Sabbat, where their origins may impress some as to their hardiness and disgust others with the truth that they were not specifically selected for the embrace. Packs form their own complicated webs of relationships, but since this is about vampire geopolitics, we will jump much higher up the ladder to the bishop, who is akin to sort of a Camarilla primogen, but because the Sabbat rejects the clans, they do not represent a particular bloodline, but instead have a certain remit, an area of authority and expertise. They serve in whatever position is useful and necessary, and they answer to an archbishop. An archbishop is more like a prince, although the comparison isn't ideal either, as Sabbat cities are not places of law and order, but places of freedom and obedience. An archbishop sets the rules, but there are usually few. They tend to be more concerned with ideological purity and creating soldiers for the army of the Sabbat. Though most archbishops attain their office by climbing up their local pile of corpses, many are also appointed, sometimes sent halfway across the world to serve in a particular city. These guys tend to be even more brutal and efficient than their homegrown counterparts. Some Camarilla cities also have archbishops, usually those on the front lines, in which case the archbishops are the people who have staked a claim on that city and want to send a message. They're leading the war effort in taking it from the Camarilla. Archbishops answer to cardinals, of which there are 13 in the world, and which oversee vast regions and implement large-scale stratagems. They often also serve as archbishops simultaneously, which is possible because being an archbishop is not nearly as involved as being a prince. The specific large areas that cardinals control vary tremendously and are redrawn flexibly all the time, as these are coveted positions held by only the most influential and brutal Sabbat leaders. So there's not a map that I could point to, only a few individual people, like Cardinal Francisco Domingo de Polonia being the cardinal of northeastern North America. And a fun fact about him is he was embraced with a sunburn. So he has a sunburn forever. And if you ever ask him about it, he will rip you to shreds on the spot. It's like sending the apprentice at the mechanic shop to go get Siemens air hooks. Cardinals sit on the consistory, the Sabbat's chief executive council, and advise, and occasionally even obey, the regent, the de jure leader of the sect, the wielder of the sword of Cain, if you will. And look, if cardinal is a coveted position with a low half-life, the regent is doubly so. Some say that only fools and true believers wish to be regent, and that even the Camarilla's leadership has the good sense of remaining hidden. In practice, the regent is often the stooge of the cardinals, used for the young ones to vent their anger and to distract them from the irony that elders are guiding them in their war against the elders. The Sabbat also has its own archons, called Templars, which may be appointed by any bishop and who usually act as the Sabbat's most elite military operatives. They may be anything from bodyguards to strike teams to ground commanders leading packs. Exalted among Templars are the paladins, handpicked by cardinals as the Sabbat's ultimate death knights. Some of them are effectively colonels fielding specialized troops, others are counterintelligence agents, others are assassins, and even others are just so badass that they function as a one-person army. Another special rank is that of the Priscus, who essentially functions as a minister for the sect's senior leadership, a bishop to the regent, if you will. Their roles are usually advisory, they tend to be experts on a very particular task that the Sabbat needs, but hold no formal authority aside from the private influence they have, and of course the respect that is afforded them being a Priscus. So while some of them are scholars and spy masters, others are simply adept at a very particular form of warfare, such as Le Sombre deep-sea mariner captains. You have to understand, very importantly, that though all this seems very neat, the Sabbat is entirely dominated by personal relationships and might-is-right carnage. There are countless ideological groupings within the organization, and many of them oppose the very idea of even a Sabbat leadership. They see themselves sort of as the purest of anarchists, ironically. They just want to rove the countryside from town to town, bleed kind dry as they hang them upside down, and rule the whole world by ruling where they are right now. They are countryside vampires, which, as you know, is not the ideal hunting ground for long-term survival. There's an ever-present push and pull in the Sabbat between the authoritarian unity factions, who advocate for a militarily and spiritually united Sabbat, and the crazy outsiders they need to control in order to do that. There are divisions between these as well, ranging from those who see it as the Sabbat's mission to free as many kindred from the clutches of the elders' machinations as possible, first and foremost, to those who wish for nothing else over the destruction of the antediluvians. When the Sabbat is ascendant, it's usually because the Unity faction is ascendant within it, and effective commanders manage to bribe or browbeat the more anarchist elements within them into obedience. A tool of the senior leadership that has been misappropriated for the purposes of ensuring loyalty is the Sabbat Inquisition, headed by a Grand Inquisitor who is appointed by the regent and who manages a whole network of inquisitors and judges. The original purpose of the Inquisition was to root out infernalism, demon worship, black magic, which, as you can imagine, needs to be quite dark in order to be undesirable in an organization like the Sabbat. But it makes sense when you consider that many Sabbat consider themselves angels in some fashion, the rightful rulers of humanity, people who have just completely different rules apply to them. Demons are always out there, trying to coax extremists away into their own cults, seductively dangling untold power. You don't want to be leaking soldiers to them. For the most part, though, the Inquisition has been used to enforce religious orthodoxy within the various disparate Sabbat ideologies. Inquisitors are the front line in enforcing the Code of Milan, which are the rules of engagement, the code of conduct in the Sabbat. It's not the first such set of rules. They all tend to fall out of favor eventually, and now, given that what has happened in Milan, the code did also. But some Sabbat at least nominally hold to it, because there's no alternative. So while it occupies the same position as the traditions, it's not the traditions. It's also not the traditions in the sense that it's not, here are these 6 rules you need to follow. It's an enormous handbook of like stories, essays, treatises, sermons, all just steeped in allegory and Aesops at every corner. In other words, something 90% of the brutes in the Sabbat would not even begin reading. It espouses ideals of loyalty to the regent and the cardinals, keeping your word to other Sabbat, helping Sabbat in need, acting honorably, though not in ways humans would agree is necessarily honorable. It exalts diablerie as the highest glory and ideal of power, describes all the different official rites which the Sabbat must practice, which alongside Voldery include mostly cruel blood orgies of various kinds. It encourages Sabbat to spy on each other and report each other to the secret police, and to settle their differences either by the will of a higher authority or a duel. You know, just to prevent too many troops from being killed in every conflict. Seriously, the Sabbat loves duels. Oh, especially to the death. Oh, they love them. They happen out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, and usually make for a nice evening's entertainment. The Sabbat's nominal headquarters are located in Mexico City. It controls many cities in the Spanish-speaking world, in South America, and also Southern Europe, as well as northeastern Canada and parts of Scandinavia, and also Southern Africa. Out in the country, bishops rule over many towns and cities the Camarilla considers too small. All this was, as recently as the 90s in a way, the glory days of the Sabbat. But today, in V5 lore, things are different. The Sabbat lives in its own ruins, leading fractured existences akin to the packs of rogue hunters that stalked the night from when the sect formed in the first place. In the 5th edition of Vampire, they were recast into the role of pure villains, as they had been in the beginning of the history of the game. 5th edition is designed around the most common playstyle of struggling with your beast, the conflict between Anarchs and Camarilla, and trying to hide from the Second Inquisition. Previous editions had a huge amount of materials that allowed you to play as Sabbat, and that was introduced to make them a little more nuanced as political opponents of the Camarilla. People who were evil and arguably insane, but who had a bit of a point in pointing out the hypocrisy of the Ivory Tower. But they don't want you to play Sabbat in 5th edition. They just want the Sabbat to be evil. And quite honestly, with some very explicit condemnation of even the idea of the Sabbat being a desirable thing to explore from the inside perspective. Many people are not happy about this at all, and I kinda understand them. I think this wouldn't have sparked as much backlash if it hadn't come with that just haughty attitude from Paradox that is the leitmotif for the little material that has been provided on the Sabbat for 5th edition. There's a lot of moral posturing that you shouldn't play as the evil anti-human death cultist with the explicitly fascist aesthetics. But like, my brother in Christ, you made the Vampires the Evil game. You don't get to be sanctimonious when people want to play evil vampires. Especially given that Paradox as a publisher doesn't exactly have a history of treating its staff very well. I'm personally not even opposed to the way the Sabbat is now. I think it makes sense as a development, I think it's cool, but part of me really feels like the publisher just wanted some virtue points here in order to get away with putting out a sourcebook just over half the size of the sourcebooks for the other two major sects while retailing at the same price. What this does mean is that you can do whatever you want with your local Sabbat in whatever city you play in. Have at it. Yes, the disciplinarians have lost the organization again. There may not even be a regent right now. There may be any number of people who have declared themselves cardinals. But there's no reason why your local guy shouldn't be an effective leader against the Camarilla, or a completely deranged demon worshipper, or a complicated council of religious extremists who murder each other, or packs of petty autocrats. You might have violent barbarian thugs or clever inducers and manipulators trying to pry the young from the clutches of the Ivory Tower. Go wild with it! You could interpret all this as the Sabbat as an organization having lost interest in controlling territory, because they're now engaged in their endgame. They're closing up shop wherever they can, keeping essential strongholds and resource streams, but otherwise just raiding Camarilla cities where they deem it necessary. Because if the greater organization has a main priority right now, these nights, it's the Gehenna Crusade. What they believe to be the final battle between the Sword of Cain and the hated Antediluvians. Finally, they will visit Cain's revenge upon the eldest elders, who are just about to rise any minute now. Ultimately though, right now, the Sabbat serve as powerful, chaotic, and above all, malleable villains. You can use the Sabbat in whichever way you want. Maybe in your chronicle, it is once again rising from the ashes. Maybe it is about to go to an all-out war with the Second Inquisition. Maybe it never even fell in the first place. Official V5 law says that the Camarilla has taken Mexico City, but who knows how true that is, and who knows how long they will keep it surrounded by Sabbat strongholds as they are. It is, after all, your world of darkness. There is, of course, another layer to the international politics of vampires: the clans themselves. They too are globe-spanning organizations, and they're not just integrated into the sects. They exist within, but overlap with them in various complicated ways. The Banu Hakim were, for the longest time, splendidly isolated in political terms. They had their redoubt in the ancient fortress of Alamut, where they could sit and worship Hakim and revel in the ultimate vengeance their clan would bring on vampire kind. They had three castes: the sorcerers, masters of blood magic, always delving deeper into its applications; the viziers, administrators who would ensure the smooth operations of the clan; and the warriors, who would go and fight the clan's battles. The reality is, though, that for most of their history, they just acted as assassins, contracted out to the highest bidder, viziers taking the jobs, dishing them out to the warriors, while giving the money to the sorcerers for their prohibitively expensive thaumaturgical research. The excuse for this was that this would keep the clan sharp as the greatest warriors when their progenitor returned. And was it not in fact them passing judgment on the kindred killed this way? Usually their clients would be Camarilla or Ashira figures. Anarchs rarely had the money, and while the Sabbat were immensely fond of the part where their enemies died, they were never too keen on the part where they actually had to pay for services rendered. And let me tell you, the Banu Hakim are prohibitively expensive. But that's not really the clan. That's just the clan's founding institution. And as founding institutions go, this elitist bunch was not a particularly involved one. The inhabitants of Alamut like to think of themselves as the true clan, but they didn't even represent the majority of it. There were Banu Hakim all over the place, and the mystical mountain fortress was little more than a story to them. Their greatest numbers are, of course, in the Middle East, where they are instrumental agents of the Ashira, the Islamic sect of kindred politics. In fact, they kind of founded it. They also founded the Black Hand, the Sabbat's most feared warrior cult, considered unfortunate waywards by the main clan, of course. Alamut also established chapter houses all over the world to create bases for their international operatives to carry out their work, and as a point of contact for potential clients. But they spawned their own brood, which did its own work. After all, there's no need to always fly in a master killer from the heart of the mountain to carry out an expensive contract when, for a lot less money, you could give the job to a local. All the offshoots of the clan paid homage to the Alamut elite, but they formed cultures of their own. Outside the Middle East, these assassin farms were the only places where the Banu Hakim could truly thrive. The Camarilla distrusted them on principle and pigeonholed them into the assassin role. When very recently the Methuselah Urshulgi awoke and told all of the followers of Abrahamic faiths to repent or die, it was not hard for the Banu Hakim to move to other established institutions of the clan. The case didn't really hold sway outside the mountain anyway, and now these outposts became centers of Banu Hakim life. As their presence became more accepted in the West, many of the outpost masters urged the new arrivals to adopt the practices of Middle Eastern Banu Hakim and meet in centers of faith, usually mosques. While many Banu Hakim now sense an opportunity to be seen as more than just killers, there are those who know that they can now ply their trade without so much oversight, and the Camarilla will make for very good clients. The Bruja are surprisingly of one mind for the fact that they are the clan of rebellion, and possess no such thing as an explicit centralized leadership apparatus. When they do organize, they tend to organize for specific movements and institutions, be they kindred or mortal ones, and then follow their practices and protocols. As with the Camarilla, Bruja really like embedding themselves in established institutions that they can rebel against, understanding themselves as catalysts of change wherever they go. Of course, the Bruja have always been the heart of the Anarch movement first and foremost. Despite their brutish reputation, the Brujah actually value intellect and debate. Many of them are scholars, as knowledge is the ultimate form of empowerment for the weak, a means to achieve freedom from the invisible chains that bind us. Where and when they meet varies from place to place, but when they do, you can be certain there's gonna be some discourse. And perhaps a nice little brawl as well. Even where they remain part of the Camarilla, their primogen is usually someone who is either elected explicitly or someone who is considered such a wise and worthy leader that there is consensus that they should represent the clan. This runs through Brujah politics. Voting happens, though it's not really common, but consensus building, or at least hearing as many voices as possible, is essential. And when you don't agree with the consensus, other Brujah expect you will try it your own way, even if that means they need to be proactive in stopping you. While Brujah elders don't usually find that they're answerable to the clan, they do prefer to be transparent with them and secure their leadership with wisdom and virtue. They expect their decisions to be questions, and will seek counsel with those of their clan whose opinions they respect without it being seen as a loss of face. They rule because they are the best at debating and sometimes having a nice little brawl. Of course, there are autocrats among them who manage to manipulate a good portion of the local Brujah into their way of thinking. We like to think of the Brujah as a socialist clan, but fascists also have a mythos of change and renewal, and among the Brujah, the siren song of Carthage is always there as a return to tradition narrative. This usually leads to strife and carnage within the Brujah of any given place, and often beyond, which princes love to exploit. This might be the reason why Brujah hold many important posts in the Camarilla, but there are very few Brujah princes. They find it difficult to secure the loyalty of their own clan without becoming strongmen themselves, at which stage their detractors will talk to the Brujah in other cities who won't just withdraw support, but often act explicitly against them. With other clans, this only happens in the most egregious cases. Not all Brujah like calling themselves the learned clan, though. Especially among the young, there is a strand of anti-intellectualism, with academics seen as nothing more than simply the establishment, with no room for nuance. Brujah elders note that this is just what happens when the weak are so disaffected that they lose all hope. They also lose all reason as they pursue ideological purity, falling into the clutches of bedeviling thought leaders that raise nations and leave nothing but chaos in their wake. It won't stop them from being eaten, even as they espouse the virtues of such change. It might surprise you to hear that the Gangrel are in some ways more organized than the Brujah. The Clan of Beasts is perhaps the only one which by and large prefers the countryside, but there's plenty of them in the city too, and even underwater. Their blood is more mutable than that of any other clan, so they have a number of offshoots which have their own signature vampiric powers adapted to their particular environment. Where this sort of thing might raise eyebrows in other clans, it's entirely normal to the Gangrel. They all have their vast roaming grounds, and when they run into each other, they tend to exchange news of the clan and wider goings-on in the world of kindred, creating a rich and long-standing oral storytelling tradition that may be a bit imprecise, but could potentially be the greatest single canon of historical knowledge of the kindred. They also engage in numerous ritualized contests to ascertain the pecking order in any given situation, and though such confrontations often involve physical skill, duels of wit and cunning are just as common. Gangrel just like to know their neighbors, and when someone moves into their territory, they prefer to ascertain whether they are an intruder or just a bumbling fool. Perhaps a new vampire. Sometimes this means you are dinner, but often Gangrel will mentor young kindred, even if they're not themselves Gangrel, in the ways of the clan. Every once in a while, when a reason arises, someone will call a ting, which you write as thing, but it's pronounced ting. It's a Norse thing, where of course the Gangrel were the dominant clan for centuries, under the rule of the Methuselah Odin Allfather. All Gangrel interested in whatever the occasion for the ting is show up, be they Anarch or Camarilla, though Sabbat often stay away for fear of destruction, and they usually go to some location deep in the wilderness. There's some posturing to establish a pecking order, but even those who fall low on the scale are allowed to participate and speak. Often other spontaneous activities like hunts and tailcraft contests emerge as side gigs, much to the chagrin of those who came there to solve a problem, not socialize. When no decisions are made, the things eventually just sort of fizzle out as more and more people lose interest. But there's a deluxe version of the ting, called the Alting, a convocation that all gangrel who hear of it must attend. Only a great and respected gangrel can call for an Alting. And what exactly constitutes one of those is really up to the individual gangrel to decide. But when you've been in the wilds long enough, you'll have heard stories of their exploits. The special thing about these isn't just their size, but the fact that all those present are expected to remain present until whatever problem is to be discussed has been definitively decided upon. You gotta stick around, even if it's inconvenient, and not showing up to an Alting is considered a grave trespass against the traditions of the clan. Tings are rare though, and Altings are especially so. Always momentous. One was called when the gangrel found a massive threat they wanted to inform the Camarilla about, and when their Justicach Xavier was rebuffed by the elders, he and many gangrel left the Ivory Tower. Another Alting was called ahead of the decision to formally move the clan away from the Camarilla, and though it was a contested one, the outcome was essentially a foregone conclusion. The more urban gangrel had been funneling Camarilla resources to their Anarch clanmates for years. Though they were talking about it openly, the Camarilla never took the beast seriously enough to listen. And the respect of taking someone seriously is the foundation of gangrel society. The Hecata are, of course, a very new political corpus, created by necessity and the will of the shadowy elder known as the Capuchin. However, given that it inherited many of its senior institutions straight from Clan Giovanni, like for instance the senior leadership council still being called the Anziani, albeit in like a different function than simply lackeys of Augustus at this point, I think it is reasonable to assume that most of the power still runs along family lines. The Giovanni embrace first and foremost members of their own family, which has descendants all over the world, who are often aware that some of their relatives are involved in shadowy dealings, and may even as mortals know of an uncle who does not age and only comes out at night. On a personal note, I do often prefer using localized versions of the Giovanni surname, given that their family has been huge for a long time, and it would have been just sort of conspicuous for them not to adapt to naming traditions as they set roots in a new place. So you have the Ivanovs, the Jensens, the Johansens, the Giannis, the Evans, and the Ben Johanan. That kind of stuff. Not to mention all the allies, vassals, and cadet branches like the Scottish Duncerne banker clan, the Sicilian Puttanesca mafia family, the American milliner money launderers, among just a huge amount of others. These would actually have gained a lot of influence in the greater clan recently, if only to take the Giovanni down a notch in relative terms. But they all work the same. They are all active mortal families with a family business, and many consider themselves distant cousins even if they're not blood related. So Hecata hide behind these ancient and powerful families, control assets through them, seek ghouls and recruits through their networks, and move in their care pretty openly. Even when some mortal family member is tempted to endanger the Masquerade, the families are simply too powerful for anyone to do anything about it. They'll just put him in a nice care home. Of course, there are a number of assorted other bloodlines which are part of the Clan of Death now, and they all had their own individual little cultures which must now find a place for themselves within this system. And I'm sure many of the old families are itching to adopt many of the newcomers into their lines, because they have spent centuries pursuing necromantic powers that are, in a way, new to the clan. Like the Samedi, now the Nation Sa'an, because they kind of split up and the man formerly known as Samedi changed his name, who have deep knowledge of the voodoo arts. Well, the dark ones, at least. I could do a whole video treatise, whatever, on the irony of voodoo being portrayed as like dark voodoo most of the time, which within sort of the logic of voodoo is essentially the opposite of actual voodoo. It's like if people thought of like Christianity and first thought of Satanist practices. But I don't have 5 more hours. The Ashurites Once vengeful Sabbat, who still have many of the clan's most ancient secrets, are also part of the clan now. And the Nagaraja, who know how to navigate the underworld like no other. The Hecata are involved in the politics of the underworld, mostly as sort of predators sitting on the fringes of whatever society remains down there. And the combination of entrenched mortal families and necromancy is the edge they seek to cultivate over the Camarilla, which they, of course, as an independent clan, try to have a cordial relationship with, without wanting to be absorbed by them. Their entire way of unlife would be incompatible with Camarilla ideals, specifically the Masquerade, and given how strict the Ivory Tower has become, it's unlikely that allowances would be made for them. The La Sombra have, for centuries, felt a tension between the rejection of the idea of clans that was nominally popular in the Sabbat and being a clan in the Sabbat in its entirety. Identifying as the ones who really started the Anarch revolt, the only clan ever to slay its own antediluvian solely for the sake of breaking its grip. Their powers were too unique, their enemies too terrified of their name, their generals too mighty within the Sabbat not to carry some level of identification. So of course they didn't entirely dissolve into the Sabbat. Probably never wanted to. The factual governing body of the La Sombra are the Amici Noctis, the Friends of the Night. The name sort of changes with the times, sometimes even the region. These days many call them the Amis Noirs, even though French hasn't really been the lingua franca for a long time. And I'm sure that one of them at least would love it if they called themselves the Amicoi della Nocto. It's an anonymous invite-only society that keeps an eye out for individuals considered exceptional within the La Sombra, and then occasionally decides to extend an invitation to one of them. This tends to happen when they're already well established, but not utterly entrenched political powerhouses, so the Amici Noctis can make use of them without being made use of by them. You'll only ever get one invitation, and it comes with strings attached, which they will not be coy about. Those few chosen La Sombra who identify with Sabbat over the clan, who had been invited to the society, would simply decline. Being a friend of the night comes with responsibilities, missions that need to be carried out, resources that can be appropriated, and above all, time spent performing clerical duties. This was in fact the original purpose of the Amici Noctis, long predating the diablerie of the La Sombra antediluvian. When a La Sombra somewhere in the world would break the laws of the clan by breaking oaths or endangering clanmates, they would be placed before a tribunal of judges wreathed in perfectly impenetrable shadow. And this tribunal would be assembled from the Amici Noctis in the area, who would then decide their fate. The anonymity of the Amici Noctis is considered essential, and they're forbidden from identifying themselves, even to each other. Though, in practice, they always seem to know. Many of the clan's other institutions were destroyed with the antediluvian, and the Amici Noctis probably helped that along. Soon they were forming panels for arbitrating not just breaches of La Sombra law, but for making all kinds of large-scale decisions for the clan. They developed their shadow powers to such an extent that they could sidestep into an aspect of the underworld and send quick messengers over vast distances, giving them a huge strategic edge, especially in a time before telecommunications, which, is useful because they kind of can't use those now. In spite of their extreme exclusivity, the Friends of the Night had a huge influence on the Sabbat, and probably still do. With the La Sombra now joining the Camarilla, the same will happen with the Ivory Tower. And, who knows if the Camarilla's too keen on that. However, the fault lines between Sabbat loyalists and Camarilla defectors among the Amici Noctis may fracture the entire institution. Many of these guys are hardliners who have swung the Sword of Cain essentially as the clan's personal weapon since its inception. At the same time, I doubt Gian Galeazzo did his big treason stunt without the approval of the Friends. The Malkavian political world is often overlooked, and I think people are sleeping on it both in-universe and outside of it. Oh, the Clan of the Moon, the lunatics, how crazy they all are. They babble nonsense all night. This is of course a stereotype. Most Malkavians are pretty lucid most of the time, and when they're not, it's not simply insanity. It's because they are exposed to a vast network of information that overwhelms their every thought with cryptic visions from the minds of other Malkavians and entities beyond. All Malkavians are connected to the web, the telepathic weave that, according to many, is the antediluvian Malkav himself, and which constantly channels emotions, ideas, and sensory impression. They're all joined, and though this isn't like a phone network, but an absolute mess of incompatible hardware and software standards running on brute force, many cunning elders learn to use it to manipulate the young. Think of it like this, right? Every person that you meet, every one of them, has thoughts in their mind that if you were confronted with them in your own mind as they exist in their mind would cause you immense distress, even if they are sort of innocuous thoughts. They don't correspond to your mental model of yourself, the world, forms of thinking, or even categories of being. Malkavians tend to meet up without even knowing it, showing up in like the strangest places all at the same time, often to witness important events or encounter problems concerning the clan as a whole. They will discuss their psychic and non-psychic experience in sometimes rather chaotic forums. Those who have a few more nights under their belts often have good advice and are the most adept at understanding the least comprehensible members of the clan, those which even other Malkavians struggle with making sense of. And this madness does not stem from a weak mind, but from a mind ravaged by the keenness with which it is attenuated to the ancient truths of the web. Perhaps more than any other clan, the Malkavians share a culture of wishing to understand what is happening to them, and maybe also why. Would be nice to find out. They embrace oracles and seers, but also scholars, intellectuals, philosophers into the clan for precisely this reason. But of course, their deep insights tend to be pretty heavy and overwhelming. No clan has studied the blood itself as much as the Malkavians. It was Malkavians who developed the system by which mortal blood resonance is classified. It was Malkavians who broke and redefined the blood bond. And many times, when a grandiose elder of some clan wants to spawn their own bloodline, they seek the advice of the Malkavians. They know secrets of Cain's Vitae that they don't even know they know. This makes them politically just crucially important, even if they are sometimes difficult to deal with. The web itself isn't even something they like to talk about with outsiders, and given that it manifests differently for every one of them, not even every Malkavian explicitly knows about it. They understand that others think of them as mad, even if they disagree. Though not always, sometimes they're like, yep, that's me. And those Malkavians who deal with politics, primarily in the Camarilla, understand that the other clans distrust the idea that there might always be someone listening in on every interaction that they have. They are of course not a hive mind either, as some would prefer to think. Many Malkavians irritate the shit out of each other for a variety of reasons, but they don't have the option to like log off and be rid of those people. Especially when two local or perhaps not so local elders are at war with each other, it can send shockwaves through the web that can severely destabilize even otherwise clear-minded individuals. The ministry have always taken a two-pronged approach to internal unity. They're not just a clan, but also a cult, though it is a cult without a religion. They disagree on the reasons and the details, but they have an overarching mission of spreading darkness and corruption in all its forms. They have long philosophical and ideological treatises and analyses translated into a number of frameworks where they discuss these topics. But with this very central precept, and with the object of their focus being the antediluvian set, they spread across the world, integrating into whatever the local belief system is. They are missionaries of a moral, or rather amoral, principle. I mean, this isn't not even that weird. Even proper religions secretize for missionary work, right? They say, yes, that guy in your belief system, that's our God, it's the same guy. Or yes, the gods are in our religion, the ones you worship. They are servants of our God. They are angels or saints or whatever. The Romans were constantly stealing gods. When you come somewhere to preach about corruption and try to entice people into the arms of darkness, you should probably do it in terms that those people understand. You'll just be more effective. For instance, in the Christian-speaking world, they sell people Satanism through sex, parties, and drugs. Though, I mean, to be fair, those things tend to be like the key recruitment tools, no matter where they are. This has created a number of schisms, especially with the hardcore of Setites, who actually still call themselves Setites across North Africa, and those spread across the rest of the world who view Set and Apophis as allegories that exist in every culture, hinting at their universal truthfulness, while barking at the narrow-minded insistence of the homebodies that just because because the Egyptians were the first to discover this, it must now always be the aesthetics of Set wherever it goes. Intolerant conservatives who believe there is the one right way fight tolerant liberals who believe there are many ways to the truth. But that truth is and remains the corruption of all there is. Something that sets the Ministry apart from the other clans here is that they pursue this in and out of the kindred world in equal measure. The Ministry has little respect for the Masquerade. They don't outright sell themselves as vampires, but they do offer a certain mysticism, and they consider mortals who are members of their cult to be part of the clan. As for kindred as well, you can join the clan no matter what clan you were embraced into. To them, it's the cult, not so much the embrace, the ministry, where the allegiance lies. They'll frequently organize events that are just outright masquerade breaches, and tend to think the Masquerade, along with the Camarilla's attachment to the ideals of humanity, works against their agenda of global corruption. The only reason any of them respect the Masquerade at all in Camarilla cities is because they don't want to be kicked out. Having to corrupt under a thin veneer of secrecy is an impediment, but not having access to a flock to corrupt at all would be way worse. Not all ministers are so pragmatic. Some are rather zealous crusaders. They just tend to be pretty ineffective. There's a lot less infighting among different branches of the ministry than you might expect. But when it does happen, it tends to be less hot warfare and more scheming behind smiling masks, accompanied by swift, surgical strikes with poisoned blades. But you'll probably never hear of it, because the ministry likes to present a front of unity to the rest of the world. If I were a suspicious man, just hypothetically, I would suggest that this is perhaps to hide just precisely how fractured they are. The Nosferatu are in, ironically, somewhat of a privileged position. They tend to know what's going on everywhere else, but very few people have any idea what goes on in their warrens. And given that those warrens are in sewers, who would even really want to? They have a reputation as being kind of one of the friendliest of the clans, at least with each other, and the warrens are the locus of their social life. And yes, we do tend to say they're in the sewers, but sewers are wet and shitty, and even when Nosferatu travel through sewers, it's the storm sewers, not the poo sewers. Most of the time, at least. And neither are conducive to putting, furniture in, or computers. Most of the underground world of any given city is made up of basements, vaults, caverns, catacombs, dungeons, tunnels, crypts, or even just spaces hidden away in foundations everyone has forgotten about. That's where the Nosferatu build their sprawling labyrinths. Some sections might not even be strictly underground at all, so long as they are insulated. Yes, many have their own spaces, and the warrens are often really more of a loosely defined area where havens cluster up than a particular building project, but they are understood as communal spaces that should serve the interests of the broader clan, which every Nosferatu has a duty of care to, and then may use in turn. And by this, I do mean all of them. All Nosferatu are welcome in the warrens, be they Camarilla, Anarch, or Sabbat. Underground, clan beats sect. Of course, an Anarch seeking refuge in the warrens will be treated as a disappointing wayward child. And a Sabbat Nosferatu is more that one estranged uncle nobody likes because he's into some crazy extreme political or religious shit, and everyone would prefer if he just sort of stopped showing up. The purpose of the warrens is of course to act as hideouts and fortifications against the Niktuku. And though they have chosen to throw their chips in with the Ivory Tower, the main body of the clan is at least sympathetic to the Sabbat's desire to kill the ancient servants of their antediluvian. They think it's a fool's errand, but they wish them good luck. They're even open to trading secrets with them, though those deals involve a lot of lies and manipulation. The information business is, after all, how the Nosferatu secure their political influence. Their networks predate the internet by millennia, and in spite of their many problems with being seen, they have always operated expediently and efficiently. They're the most strongly interlinked of all the clans, if not exactly the most hierarchical. Very few Nosferatu were princes, and those who are usually took the job reluctantly, like Calibros, who was the primogen of New York and then was just named prince after the Battle of New York, very much against his better judgment, and who eventually abdicated when he thought that the cities would be in better hands with someone else. Even when they're kingmakers, they like to remain unseen. There tend to be Nosferatu in high court positions always, but nothing too flashy. They prefer to be paid in the privilege of being left to their own devices. And let me tell you, those devices can get pretty weird. It's easy to forget what it's like to be a human when you basically never talk to human beings ever, and all the people around you look like Count Orlok. The Ravnos are difficult to talk about because they have been, let's say, significantly retconned. In the early days, they almost entirely fulfilled the stereotype of like the evil gypsy trickster. Their clan bane was like literally that they were compulsive criminals. And that was changed to have always been the need to move around. They cannot stay in the same place for too long. That change was pretty early on too, so this is like not a 5th edition change. The main body of the clan is in India, where they were one of the most powerful clans, usually kind of at the top of the food chain even, although the Ventru were in stark competition with them. Their society was split into castes determined mostly by lineage, and each of these castes had a different function in vampiric society. Vampires of other clans could even be adopted into this caste system to a certain extent, which made Ravnos culture into sort of the backbone of kindred life in India for millennia. However, because of their war with the Hungry Dead and the subsequent awakening of their antediluvian, their clan was almost eradicated all over the world, very recently. Most of them went into violent frenzies that made them kill everything that moved. So currently, they're on the brink of extinction, and as far as the rest of vampire society is concerned, also on parole. But you can still find them. Especially among the young, many are left. And it appears that among the Romani peoples, their mindless frenzy was the most contained. So okay, obviously, the Ravnos predate the Roma and all of the various groups therein by millennia. And while the Roma are not the only nomadic society of the world, they pretty much are in the Western world. There's very few others. Their lifestyle is pretty conducive to a Ravnos seeking to build some sort of power base, as opposed to always just journeying from place to place. Imagine for a second you're a group of Romani people, right? Always on the road, which is dangerous, especially at night when the monsters come out. You're marginalized wherever you go, deprived of opportunities, and treated as like magic monster people, no matter how well-intentioned and honest you are. Literally, people see you as less than human. Would you not accept the patronage of a dark being of the night, powerful and knowledgeable, who will treat you as a sort of family, protect you from danger, and make your warriors strong? The Ravnos who travel with the Romani do feed on them, which is considered an honor because that's just the effect of the kiss. But they don't kill them. This they do in the cities in which they hunt, by which they do of course give those same Romani an even worse reputation, right? They showed up, few people died, then they left, dying stopped. Vampires are parasites. They ultimately exploit the vulnerability of the Romani, and many Romani groups very much understand this. The Ravnos have a vested interest in those stereotypes and that isolation persisting. So I argue it's possible that they are the ones who created them in the first place, to have a vulnerable group to prey upon. Still, Romani society, their culture, defines the ways in which Ravnos organize and communicate, even the ones who exist in completely different cultural contexts. Often they will have little concern for the masquerade, so long as it stays within that traveler culture. Of course, the people they send to exchange messages don't really understand what they mean either. But let's be serious, right? When a Romani person shows up to the local police station to tell the cops that one of their wagons is home to a vampire who drinks people's blood, do you think they'll be taken seriously? The Toreadors see themselves as the true founders of the Camarilla, the priests of the way of humanity. They are among the most powerful of clans. Very few cities have none of its most influential positions held by a Toreador, and there are many Toreador princes. The manner in which the clan is organized is hard to pin down, as their very ethos is about going with with the times and staying in touch with the trends of mortal society. They're not just trend followers, in fact, they're trend setters, given their extensive holdings in the arts and entertainment industry. They're rarely the creative minds themselves. Their spark tends to sort of fizzle out after a few centuries, as the work of keeping up with the times becomes so all-consuming that they lose themselves in it. But they do keep their exquisite taste and will prop up mortal artists that say what they want them to say. Of course, they also have a love for the pomp and splendor of the old and venerated, the classics, if you will. Mostly because humans are also fascinated by that kind of stuff. So they're always walking the line of formal and informal, changing fashions like clothes, I guess. One week they meet up in the VIP section of a nightclub. The next week it's a Baroque gala at a historic theater, followed by a cocktail party in a penthouse filled with old school postmodern art and an avant-garde jazz quartet. It's a constant race of keeping up with the social circles. You can't allow yourself to become crusty, or you will lose all your allies and turn into sort of a curiosity the clan invites for their amusement. You can't play it safe. You need to be daring enough to try things even when they seem stupid. Not every fashion the Toreador pursue ultimately pans out. That's part of the fun. Over time, you'll realize that they wear every aesthetic with a hint of irony. Like it's always a costume. Like they are tourists in the modern world. Albeit of the variety that has read so many books on the subject that they know more than a native. The true ties of the Toreador are, of course, the ties of money. The entertainment industry is a global behemoth, and they are among its greatest puppet masters. It's easy for them to move money and talent around the globe. Things that would raise Second Inquisition hackles anywhere else are just an accepted part of the eccentricity of artists. And what they can't do with money, they can do with social capital cultivated among mortals infatuated with their dark and ethereal beauty. Members of every clan turn to them for advice on how to stay in touch with both humanity at large and the humanity within. No other clan understands the psychology of vampires better than the Toreador, and they have ways of bringing you back from the brink of falling to your beast that no one else seems to be able to replicate. The Toreador smile and say, there's no real secret to it. You just need to have a wellspring of humanity within yourself to help others with their own. Of course, to the Toreador, this means having intense flings and long, drawn-out love affairs with kindred of other clans, building infatuation among them that they are just as likely to use as political capital as they are to have it simply strengthen their humanity. After all, what is more life-affirming than the flutter of your own quickened heart? The Tremere were, up until recently, the simplest to describe. The entire clan, at least the Camarilla parts and like all the other parts were hunted down mercilessly, was organized in something called the Pyramid. Every member was bloodbound to their immediate superior, ideally aiming for every one of those superiors having 7 people blood bonded to them. The Council of 7, the 7 elders who make up the Tremere leadership, would each have 7 pontifices, regional leaders in charge of anywhere from several smaller to one regular-sized or part of a large country. Each pontifex in turn would have 7 lords, managing smaller domains but still comprising several cities, or sometimes one large metropolis. They would each have 7 regents, leaders of a local chantry, and thus a city. Each regent would have 7 magisters, senior Tremere with their magical training fully accomplished, each of whom might in turn have 7 apprentices. And then also there was a pool of acolytes who did not necessarily correspond to the number 7, but who was like made up of Tremere who were of the blood, but like who hadn't necessarily proven themselves worthy yet. And also occasionally even non-Tremere, though this wouldn't happen in like the purest European chantries, and even the other ones, very, 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 very rare. Perhaps the rarest of the things. There's a number of additional gradations and titles and postulations for each of the ranks that make the system infinitely more complicated, which only sort of adds to the magic of authority the clan clothes itself in. In practice, the whole 7 thing didn't always work, especially on the lower ranks. But it was a decent aim, and anyway, the purpose of it was to enforce total obedience down from the very top into every corner of the clan. But of course, course, ever since the Second Inquisition destroyed the Prime Chantry in Vienna, and the Tremere are no longer capable of blood bonding other vampires, the strict obedience enforced by the pyramid suddenly cracked and broke. It was a very rigid structure, with very little give, and the world took a hammer to it. Luckily, the blood bond wasn't the only way in which the Tremere ensured loyalty. The social life of the clan revolves around the Chantry, a special magical edifice in a given city filled with occult libraries and magical artifacts. Chantries can get pretty odd, like a vampire Hogwarts in every city, usually to the extent that you are expected to keep at least apartments there. Only senior members of the clan can access all the amenities of the Chantry, always creating deeper and deeper circles of initiation and encouraging the hoarding of knowledge in the service of the elders. Competition, cutthroat. Over time, this led to the creation of various sanctioned and not so sanctioned secret societies within the clan, which now form the backbone of the political factions trying to make decisions for its future. Some advocate letting it fracture, right? Diversifying in a way, usually because their plans for their region of the world would be incompatible with the aims of the clan at large. Others want to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, by force if necessary. And even others find the shattering unfortunate, but, they have other concerns to deal with in their domain. Most agree that the biggest problem facing the clan today is the fact that the magic is leaking. There are more and more independent Tremere, especially Anarchs, and members of other clans with access to their well-hoarded secrets of blood magic. Given that none of the other clans trusts or likes the Tremere very much, their monopoly over blood sorcery was always the thing that made them into one of the most powerful Camarilla clans. And now that the Banu Hakim have joined the Ivory Tower, the Warlocks are scrambling. For centuries they've operated under a central command, and I honestly cannot say that they can adapt to such a rapidly changing world, because they may not know what to do if nobody tells them. The Tzimisce are all islands unto themselves, somewhat split between Sabbat hardliner spiritual mystics of inhumanity and exalted rulers of domains warped by that same inhumanity. It's the inhumanity that defines both groups. One is an international political force, while the other tends to be a regional powerhouse that princes, bishops, and barons need to deal with. They have never liked to identify themselves in human terms, always existing in a society apart, and given that most vampires try to cling to their own humanity as well, in a sense, the Tzimisce consider themselves apart from them also. Thanks to their mastery of vicissitude and rather sedentary lifestyles, they all develop into different flavors of blue and orange morality. It's just hard to retain a human-like moral framework while also being able to warp flesh at will. And then there's so much different furniture to transform your servants into, you wouldn't expect any two such devils to come out the same. Most Tzimisce respect the few rules that the Sabbat has, but they also have their own sets of laws that echo the decorum of old Eastern European nobility. Since they consider themselves absolute rulers, but cannot trust each other, and also because their havens are like treacherous nightmarescapes, they value hospitality above all else. There are a lot of archaic little rituals that ultimately boil down to establishing a relationship between guest and host, who may not harm one another in any way. These exchanges of gifts and pleasantries may seem quaint to some, but you have to keep in mind here that this is two aliens meeting. And they're not just aliens to you, they are aliens to each other as well. Although the fact that one of them looks like a blue Horatio with 24 compound eyes, while the other is a crab octopus humanoid with leathery wings, might have tipped you off to that a little bit. The trappings of humanity are just a language they share, a tool they utilize. In order to maximize the potential of their human cattle, both in terms of feedstock and for future embraces, the Clan of Dragons has spent the last several millennia running eugenics breeding programs, creating whole families of ghouls addicted to vampiric vitae called revenants, who have just the right combination of traits for their masters. Although they do quite enjoy experimenting and just sort of seeing where things go. Idle curiosity regularly brings Tzimisce to acts that the Hague has never even heard of. Not all Tzimisce are this deranged, of course. Most of them are, and with the shattering of the Sabbat, this is only going to get worse. But there are, maybe a handful of Tzimisce in the world who would align themselves with the Camarilla potentially. And while there are quite a few of them among the Anarchs, it's not exactly among those kinds of Anarchs who love like freedom and democracy. Although especially among younger generations, and in a human culture more defined by self-actualization, I can see this changing a little bit in the future. It's going to be interesting to see if and how they manage to integrate into a world defined by the Second Inquisition. The Ventru are, of course, the kings of the Camarilla. At least they see themselves as such. The other clans are anything from queens in the case of the Toreador to pawns in the case of the Gangrel. Their own job is to always ensure that everyone else is ideally positioned to do what they do best. They've always embraced from the ranks of the upper class, right? Merchants and nobles. Though these days, increasingly merchants because nobles have no more power unless they are also merchants. They're entrenched in the world of money, both old and new, and some of the old money folks are reluctant to go with the new money times. Both have their advantages, of course, right? New money being flexible and ubiquitous and accessible, old money being nebulous and diversified, possessing things that no amount of new money could buy. They meet in boardrooms and country estates, performing clan politics in the format of business meetings, mixing centuries of different varieties of corporate-speak euphemisms to devise and implement action plans. They love meetings. They believe in politics as a means unto itself, as something that brings a certain rightness to the social order, allowing them to put things in their proper place. They have very little use for democracy, though merit matters to them just as much as honor does. It is possible to rise through the ranks of the Ventru, and they reward good service. This has made them flexible enough to admit that it's not blue blood or race or gender that makes you most suited for the embrace, but purely your skills and willingness to apply yourself. Although the genuine noble-born Ventru of centuries past will note that a good pedigree comes with a family line to shepherd through the ages. Because many of the older Ventru were knights, there is a culture of chivalry in the clan, not in like a chauvinist sense, but in a martial one. There are rules of engagement, expectations of self-sacrifice, priorities by which to make decisions, obligation to your subjects, loyalty to your patrons. They call this dignitas, and the more dignitas you have, the more respect you're going to get from others in the clan. Of course, dignitas isn't something you can just measure in numbers. It's not about how much money you have. It's a social phenomenon, entirely related to how other Ventru see you. The ranks of the Ventru have a million titles in dozens of languages. Just like the modern corporate world likes its convoluted word chains to make managers feel more important, and just like the aristocracy of old had their weird offices. So it's not as clear a hierarchy as you might find with, like, the Tremere, for instance. Individuals have responsibility and autonomy. They're not just cogs in a machine. This, too, is part of dignitas. The senior-most leadership is known as the Board of Directors, although many still prefer the old name, the Ephorate, comprising the world's most important and powerful Ventru lords and ladies. They make the big decisions, arbitrate disputes within the clan, and allocate resources. Usually the resources of those beneath them. They continue to be the clan with the most princes and the most domains, and in spite of major losses to their senior-most ephors in recent years, their well-groomed heirs are ready to step up. The real question is whether they will change the clan in ways that will allow it to adapt, or if they will reinforce the old foundations and hope to weather the storm that way. And before we move on to our last section of the video, a note on the Salubri, because I know people are gonna ask. Yes, they are around. There are, in fact, a few of them. But that's it. It is a few. They are not a clan, really, even if it says that in the rulebook. They're an errant bloodline that was hunted, like, almost to extinction centuries ago. Canonically, there are maybe like a handful of them left in the world. And while one of them may be in your chronicle, they're not really like a global political force by any stretch of the imagination. And they haven't been for a very long time. Maybe they will be one day, but I believe that day is still rather far off. Do not see with your third eye. It's not real. You are being fooled. Keep it closed. Of course, there's much more to the geopolitics of vampires than just the Camarilla, Anarchs, and Sabbat, or even, frankly, just vampires. Make no mistake, the Camarilla is the single most powerful global entity of vampire politics. Western Europe is firmly in their domain. And while Central, Southern, Northern, and Eastern Europe have always had Sabbat and sometimes Anarch holdfasts, they remain dominated by the Camarilla as well. Australia has its Anarchs and Sabbat in the interior, but everything that matters is Camarilla. The Americas are, of course, a slightly different story. North America is for the most part in Camarilla hands, at least like the very important cities are. Maybe not all of them. Central America remains by and large in the hands of the Sabbat, though never without significant Camarilla presence. South America has been embattled for centuries, a complex back and forth. Buenos Aires, Bogotá, Santiago de Chile, and Caracas have been firm Camarilla staging grounds for a long time. The Sabbat, on the other hand, has always controlled Lima and São Paulo. In fact, the Archbishop of São Paulo is none other than Gratiano de Veronese, the man who diablerized the La Sombra antediluvian. Actually, Brazil especially is a hotly contested battleground between the Toreador and La Sombra as proxies for Camarilla and Sabbat. I know they love Vampire the Masquerade in Brazil, but really all of South America is so underplayed as a region. It's criminal. I found out recently it used to be when you would go to a LARP in Brazil, it wouldn't be like the medieval shit that we'd think about. That would also be happening, but the default association with LARP was Vampire the Masquerade. Anything else was like more niche LARP. The Middle East and North Africa are not Camarilla territory. They instead belong to the Ashira, which in practice functions much like the Camarilla, but instead of the traditions, it espouses Islam as its guiding ideology. It was founded by the Banu Hakim Suleiman ibn Abdullah, who claims to have spoken to the Prophet Muhammad one time and to have been instantly converted to Islam. The Ashira holds that just because kindred are damned, this does not give them leeway to spurn Allah, for He is ultimately their God and creator, and they live in His world. All clans exist within the Ashira, but because clan is not as important here, ironic, I know, given that this is the region where like the clans come from, they often consider themselves somewhat separate from their Western cousins. Not all Ashira are devout Muslims, of course. There's members of other religions in there which are treated with tolerance and respect, so long as they follow the main edicts of the sect. They see themselves as the all-vampire government that way, much like the Camarilla. Relations between Ashira and Camarilla have been pretty good for centuries, but recently, in light of the Banu Hakim schism, the Second Inquisition, and the Sabbat's Gehenna Crusade, they have entered a formal alliance and are now slowly coordinating and integrating institutions, all the while attempting to keep the core of their identities separate. As I said earlier, India was for a long time dominated by the Ravnos clan order, but ever since colonialism, there have been strong Camarilla cities there. And since the Ravnos social order collapsed recently, the Camarilla is trying to claim the ashes. But they are not the only ones. Coming from the east are the Hungry Dead, who always coexisted with the kindred. They are vampires, but not Cainites. They function differently in many ways, the most crucial of which is that they have no clans or bloodlines. They are souls who fought their way out of hell, and they organize in schools of thought called dharmas, which function a little bit like voluntary clans, even sort of werewolf tribes, if you will, and which form an enormous variety of complicated institutions and political networks that stretch all across Asia and often beyond. There's no time to get into them. I said last time I will cover them. It is going to happen. But it's worth noting that, much like with India, the Camarilla can be found in all the Asian cities that were major colonial power hubs, as well as Tokyo and various other Japanese cities. It coexists with the local Hungry Dead apparatus of power, whatever that may look like, and as a consequence is often organized in rather unexpected ways. There's Camarillas without princes, Camarillas with democracy, Camarillas subservient to certain Hungry Dead, who are then effectively princes, but they're not Cainite vampires, Camarillas with martial law autocrats. That's not very surprising. Maybe I shouldn't have said that one last. They all pledge allegiance to the traditions in the Western Camarilla, but they are in practice quite isolated from it. A similar situation can be found in sub-Saharan Africa. The vampires here, who are called Laibon as an overarching term, though that changes from language to language, are clearly kindred. Like, you can identify their clans a lot of the time, though they have a variety of odd bloodlines, just as you might find in Europe, and they even have Cain as a figure in their various secret histories and creation myths. However, they don't really identify with being undead monsters, but understand themselves as human-like spirits who descend from and often serve other great spirits. Vampiric society here is organized in ways that are truly, utterly different from the West. For instance, here the Nosferatu are considered the clan of kings, usually the rulers of Libon courts. The Gangrel are lawkeepers and emissaries, and the Malkavians are unspeakable devils hunted on sight. Again, much like Europe, there's a huge amount of regional variance. Africa is enormous after all. And even here, the Camarilla controls many large and important cities, often clashing with the Libon. They do offer all Libon the option to join and live by Camarilla rules, of course, but most of the kindred who live here are the Western varieties of their respected clans, even if they are people born in Africa. I might make a video on the Libon one of these days, but it's a complex topic, and I don't think the books that have been published on it give like the level of depth and nuance that I would ideally like. This is not surprising. Honestly, it's a bit of a niche product within a niche product, even more so than The Hungry Dead, the Kuei Jin, but those do have some really good fan materials. So I would be interested in such materials from maybe African vampire fans, or at least people knowledgeable about those areas of the world. When it comes to the non-vampiric entities, vampires find themselves in rather a privileged position. The veil of lies that is the Masquerade has made it so most other supernatural entities are apprehensive about dealing or interfering with them. Even like more so than any supernatural being is apprehensive about dealing with other supernatural beings. They have such a variety of powers and such like unpredictable power levels that most just give them a wide berth unless they absolutely have to engage with them. And most of the time, that isn't necessary. The greatest source of like inter-supernatural being competition is the resource conflict over what mages call nodes, werewolves call cairns, and changelings call balefires, which are all variations of like kinda the same thing. Oh, there's a lot of different types of cheese? They're all cheese. They're places of power where magical energy concentrates. And except for like edge cases, vampires don't really have much use for them. The Tremere do have some conflict with mages because of this, specifically like the houses of Hermes from which they descend, but that is really their concern and does not affect vampire geopolitics at large. Vampires also have few magical artifacts, and the ones they do have tend to run on vampiric vitae, and thus would be effectively useless to other supernatural beings. They're city people, and thus rarely cross paths with werewolves, who obviously prefer the countryside. Again, like some niche conflicts here, but nothing that like defines vampires on a large scale. Some changelings might object to kindred messing with their dreamers, but given how rare vampires are, statistically speaking, it's unlikely that they would clash over this often. Maybe in cases of potent blood resonance, but there's really just enough people out there. Mummies play a part in the vampiric world, but also on the very fringes. And where kindred are rare, mummies are so much rarer. Because of their proximity to death and the abilities of several clans, perhaps the greatest conflict exists with wraiths. The Hecata enslave ghosts to do their bidding, the La Sombra have been known to use the underworld as a shortcut, and blood magic does sometimes do things to ghosts as well. Not to mention that kindred probably create a disproportionate number of ghosts. And of course, there has been a war between ghosts and vampires in the underworld recently, perhaps for the first and only time over territory. Usually vampires live in the Skinlands and wraiths in the Shadowlands. Well, I mean, neither of them live, but you know what I'm saying. The overlap is just not that strong. Demons! Well, I mean, aren't they always there? Somehow? Waiting? Approaching? From a distance? Which I suppose leaves only the Technocratic Union, the definitely not mages whose worldview is opposed to the existence of vampires, but who have admitted defeat in their quest to destroy them. I argue they have a significant influence on the kindred world, because they back the Camarilla, since the Camarilla upholds the Masquerade. I don't, and I cannot stress this enough, think that the Camarilla is like a front for the technocracy. It predates the technocracy by several centuries. They are simply organizations whose pragmatic interests are aligned to a certain extent. There's probably a bit of coordination between the groups at the highest level, but I doubt either would be too keen on admitting that. They both probably think they're playing the other. And honestly, I think the two are intertwined through the ties of the mortal world more than anything. In terms of finance, the Camarilla can probably match, if not beat, the Syndicate Convention in terms of financial leverage, because it is old money in ways that the technocracy cannot even conceive of. Well, maybe like some guys can. But with how deeply interlinked the financial networks of the world are, they probably end up pulling money from the same slush funds here and there, making each other unfathomably wealthy without even being aware of it. And if you want to know more about all these entities, I have a whole playlist outlining them in exquisite detail for you to peruse. I have so many of these videos now, I can't even attach them in like cards that would show up here. I can't do that anymore. If you have only been sticking to Vampire the Masquerade thus far, you have no idea how deep the World of Darkness truly is. Which makes a lot of sense, of course. It's the flagship gain line, and as complicated as it is, I don't think they want too much interference from the other ones. If you play another game line, it's kind of reasonable to assume you know at least a little something about Vampire, but if you play Vampire, you probably don't know much about the others, if you're aware of their existence at all. And that is exactly where I will leave you today. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. Remember to watch The Secret History of Vampires. This double feature was an absolutely enormous project. The script I wrote for what ended up being 2 videos is the size of a novel. I am swimming in stress hormones. I'm glad to have done it, but to be honest with you, I cannot keep doing it the way I'm doing it right now. Especially because I have actual novels to write. I am aiming to do more things like this in the future. Like sort of the Frederick Knudsen style disappearing for a while to drop something good bit suits me well, I think. Although to be honest with you, I will probably continue putting out way more content than him. I'm trying to find a solid middle ground, right? I'm not trying to disappear for like months and months and months at a time. I'm not trying to have like 2 videos a year. I'm trying to go above that. But I cannot live my life steeped with like a level of stress where I'm always tasting my stomach acid, like right now. Ironically, it'll allow me to get more done, I think, because I'll live longer. So you have that to look forward to. I am so appreciative of your support in allowing me to do this thing I love. I hope I can continue it in a way that you enjoy. And in that spirit, see you around, folks. It's been a pleasure.